Almost 5 months ago, my mother grabbed the microphone at my wedding before I had even finished saying my vows. "This wedding is a disgrace," she said. 180 guests went silent. I stood beneath an arbor covered in white roses and jasmine, my hand still wrapped around Ethan's. Beyond the garden walls, Charleston was settling into a warm March evening. A minute earlier, I had been listening to the man I loved promise me a life built on honesty. Then my mother, Mary Ann Bennett, stepped into the aisle in pale blue silk and turned my wedding into a public trial. "You turned your back on everything this family gave you," she continued. Her voice carried through the speakers with the polished certainty she normally reserved for charity luncheons and hotel galas. "And now you expect us to sit here and pretend this is something to celebrate?" A few people looked down at their programs. Others stared straight at me because embarrassment makes people curious even when they know they should look away. Near the third row, my younger sister Erica sat rigid beside our parents' empty chairs. She had come with them. She had heard whatever they had planned before they arrived. Yet she said nothing. That hurt more than I wanted it to. Then my father stood. Douglas Bennett had spent most of his life in rooms where people stopped talking when he began. He was 66, silver-haired, perfectly tailored, and still carried himself like the lobby of the Beaumont belonged wherever he happened to be standing. "You've brought shame on this family," he said. "Your grandfather built something people respected. Your mother and I spent our lives protecting that name, and this is how you repay us." My fingers tightened around my bouquet. I did not cry. I did not ask him to stop. I did not explain myself to 180 people who had come to watch me get married, not defend my childhood. I looked at the officiant. "Please continue." My father actually scoffed. For 1 second, I saw the old expression I knew better than my own reflection. That faint smile he wore whenever he believed I was pretending to be stronger than I really was. He expected me to fold. He expected Ethan to get embarrassed. He expected the room to belong to him, because rooms had belonged to him for most of his adult life. Then Ethan turned fully toward him. My father's smile disappeared. His shoulders went still. His eyes moved from Ethan's face to mine, then back again. I had seen my father angry, arrogant, amused, dismissive, even frightened once or twice in my life. I had never seen him look as if the floor beneath him had suddenly changed shape. For 6 months, Douglas Bennett had been trying to get 10 minutes with the man standing beside me. He just hadn't known that man was my groom. Before I tell you what my father wanted from Ethan badly enough to spend 6 months chasing his office, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from today. Stay with me, because what happened at that wedding turned out to be only the first crack in a family story I had believed for 7 years. And if you enjoy stories about families, betrayal, consequences, and people finally learning where their boundaries belong, I'd love for you to subscribe and stay with the channel. The strange thing was that I did not understand my father's reaction immediately. At that moment, I was still trying to protect my wedding. My mother remained in the aisle with the microphone in her hand. She looked at Douglas as if waiting for him to finish whatever speech they had prepared together. Instead, he just stared at Ethan. I turned back toward the officiant. "Please," I said again, "continue." My mother found her voice first. "Lauren, you cannot seriously expect us to sit down after everything you've done." I faced her. "You have 2 choices, Mom. You can sit down and stay for my wedding, or you can leave. But you are not stopping it." Her mouth opened. I kept going before she could speak. "You've said what you wanted to say. Dad has said what he wanted to say. This ceremony is continuing." I was not calm because I felt nothing. My heart was pounding so hard beneath my dress that I could feel every beat against the boning of the bodice. My palms were damp. I could sense the weight of every person watching me. But being afraid of a scene and surrendering to one are not the same thing. For years, my parents had depended on my fear of making things worse. If they pushed hard enough, I would leave the room. If they embarrassed me, I would go quiet. If they accused me of being difficult, I would spend the next week wondering whether they were right. I was 38 years old on my wedding day. I was done giving them that kind of power. One of the venue coordinators approached my mother carefully and held out her hand for the microphone. Marianne hesitated, then surrendered it, as if she were doing the woman a personal favor. My father sat down without another word. That frightened me more than another insult would have. Ethan squeezed my hand. He did not turn toward Douglas and threaten him. He did not tell security to throw my parents out. He did not announce who he was, or make some grand speech about protecting his wife. He simply looked at me and asked quietly, "Do you want to keep going?" Yes. That was all I needed from him. The officiant resumed. Some of the tension slowly left the garden. People shifted in their chairs. Someone in the back coughed. A breeze moved through the trees and stirred the edge of my veil. I looked at Ethan and forced the rest of the room out of focus. We finished our vows. We exchanged rings. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, the applause started unevenly, then grew until it filled the garden. Ethan kissed me, and for a few seconds, I let myself believe my parents had already spent all the damage they had brought with them. I should have known Douglas Bennett better. We had barely reached the corridor connecting the garden to the reception rooms when I heard him behind me. Lauren. I kept walking. Lorraine. I stopped because there were staff carrying trays through the hallway and guests moving toward cocktails. I was not going to stage round 2 in front of them. Ethan slowed beside me. "I can handle this," I told him. He studied my face for a second, then nodded. My father reached us. My mother was a few steps behind him, but what struck me was how completely Douglas had changed. The anger was gone, so was the disgust. He looked almost breathless. "Why didn't you tell me?" I stared at him. "Tell you what?" He glanced at Ethan as if the answer should have been obvious. "Who he is." That was when something inside me shifted. Not because Ethan had become more impressive than he had been 5 minutes earlier. Ethan was exactly the same man I had walked into that garden intending to marry. But my father was different. "What exactly do you think I was supposed to tell you?" Douglas lowered his voice. "That he's Ethan Mercer." I looked at Ethan, then back at my father. Yes, his name is Ethan. Ethan Mercer. The way he said the surname finally made me understand that this was not about recognizing someone from a magazine or a charity event. "You know him?" My father gave me a look so incredulous it bordered on anger again. "Of course I know who he is." "No, Dad, you know who he is. That isn't the same as knowing him." Marianne stepped closer. "Lauren, don't start." I almost laughed. "You came to my wedding, took a microphone out of someone's hand, called my marriage a disgrace in front of 180 people, and now you're telling me not to start?" My mother looked toward the reception doors, already checking who might be close enough to hear us. My father ignored her. "You never told us his last name. You never asked." "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. For months, my parents had known I was marrying a man named Ethan. That was about as much effort as they had made to learn. They had refused our engagement dinner. They had refused the rehearsal dinner. When I sent them the wedding website, my mother told me she was not interested in reading a page designed to make strangers admire my choices. Our printed invitation had been intentionally simple. Lauren and Ethan. The date. The venue. Nothing more. They had initially declined anyway. When they changed their minds less than a week before the ceremony, Erica was the one who gave them the venue details. I had not hidden Ethan from them. They had simply never cared enough to ask. Douglas looked at Ethan again. "You're with Meridian." Ethan's expression did not change. "I am. Managing partner." "Yes." My father drew a breath. "I've been trying to get into your office for 6 months." Ethan said nothing. "I called. My banker called. Charles Wynn reached out. I sent 2 letters. I don't manage access through family members," Ethan said. It was a perfectly ordinary sentence, spoken without heat. But my father seemed to hear something else in it. "This is different," Douglas said quickly. "Obviously." "No," I said, "it isn't." He turned toward me. "Lauren, stay out of this." There it was. Less than 20 minutes after discovering that the groom he had just humiliated was someone he desperately wanted access to. My father had already returned to speaking to me as if I were an employee standing in the wrong meeting. I felt something settle inside me. "This is my wedding. You came to me. I need 10 minutes with him." "No." His face tightened. You don't even know what this is about. Then tell me. I said it's business. That isn't an answer. It concerns the family. I looked at my mother. Her lips were pressed together so tightly the color had disappeared from them. Then I looked back at my father. What family business? Douglas hesitated. That hesitation told me more than the answer would have. Ethan touched my elbow lightly. Lauren, we should get to the reception. My father stepped forward. Ethan, 10 minutes. Tomorrow, Monday, whenever works. I'm not asking for anything improper. I just need an opportunity to explain the situation directly. Ethan remained polite. If Meridian is involved in something with your company, the appropriate people are already handling it. They won't give me access to you. Then there's probably a reason for that. Douglas flushed. I held up one hand before the conversation could become something else. No business tonight. My father stared at me. You cannot be serious. I've never been more serious. This affects all of us. Then it will still affect all of us tomorrow. I turned away. For the first time in my life, I left my father standing in a corridor, without waiting to see whether he approved. I wish I could say the rest of the reception became easy. It didn't. My mother spent the first half hour moving through the room as if she were hosting the event she had just tried to ruin. She smiled too brightly. She spoke to cousins. She complimented flowers she had criticized when I first chose them. Douglas barely spoke at all. I kept catching him looking toward Ethan. Erica avoided me. That bothered me. She had not taken the microphone. She had not repeated our parents' words. But she had sat beside them while they did it. Once, across the reception room, our eyes met. She looked away first. I told myself I did not care. That was a lie. Later, while changing shoes in the bridal room, I opened my small evening bag looking for lipstick and felt something cool beneath my fingers. The old brass key. It had not opened a door at the Beaumont in more than 15 years. The hotel had converted to electronic cards long ago. But I had kept that heavy, useless key through 4 apartments, 2 jobs, 1 move across Charleston, and 7 years of pretending the Beaumont meant nothing to me. I had brought it that day as my something old. When I was 16, my father had pressed it into my palm while we stood behind the front desk of the hotel. One day, he told me, this place would be mine to protect. For years, I had believed that sentence meant he trusted me. At 38, sitting in my wedding dress with my mother's insult still echoing in my head, I wasn't sure what it meant anymore. I closed my fingers around the key, then put it back into my bag. I did not hide in that room. I fixed my lipstick and returned to my own reception. My mother intercepted me almost immediately. We need a family picture. No. She blinked. Lauren. I said no. People are going to notice if we don't take one. They already noticed you hijacking the ceremony. Her expression hardened. I am trying to salvage this. I'm not. I walked past her. That was another thing I had spent years learning. Marianne Bennett believed every disaster could be corrected if everyone stood close together for a photograph afterward. I did not owe her evidence that we were fine. Ethan and I danced. I spoke to friends. I ate part of my dinner while it was still warm. I laughed with people who had actually come because they were happy for me. I refused to let my parents consume everything good about the day, simply because they had managed to damage part of it. By the time the reception began winding down, I thought they had finally given up. Then my father found me near the garden doors. He looked tired now, rather than furious. Lauren, please. That word from him was rare enough to stop me. I faced him. You get 1 minute. His eyes flicked toward Ethan, who was across the room speaking with 2 friends. I need you to ask him to talk to me. No. Would you at least listen before answering? I listened when you called my wedding a disgrace. His jaw tightened. That was before I knew. I stared at him. Before you knew what? That my husband could be useful to you? He flinched. Only slightly, but I saw it. You don't understand what's happening. Then explain it. Douglas glanced around the reception room. For once, he seemed afraid someone might overhear him. Bennett Heritage has been exploring strategic options. I almost smiled at the corporate language. Dad, we're looking at buyers. The smile disappeared. For what? He looked at me. The Beaumont. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. The Beaumont was not just another hotel in our company. It was the hotel. The century-old building my grandfather had restored. The lobby where Erica and I had done homework after school. The ballroom where my mother had hosted every major family celebration that mattered to her. The place my father had once told me, Bennett's did not sell. You're selling the Beaumont? We are evaluating a transaction. That means yes. We haven't signed anything. And Meridian? He exhaled. They're one of the most serious buyers. Everything about the last hour rearranged itself. The 6 months of calls. The letters. The way my father had frozen when Ethan turned around. His sudden interest in my husband's full name. I looked across the room at Ethan. He was laughing at something one of our friends had said. He looked completely removed from the panic standing in front of me. You came here not knowing who I was marrying, I said slowly. You stood in front of everyone and told me I had disgraced you. Then the second you realized Ethan might be able to help you, you wanted me to arrange a meeting. Douglas rubbed a hand over his mouth. This is bigger than a wedding. No, tonight it isn't. Lauren, if Meridian walks away, this could become very bad. You said there were other buyers. There are. Then deal with them. It's not that simple. I waited. My father looked toward the garden, then back at me. When he finally spoke, his voice was low enough that I almost missed it. If this deal falls apart, we could lose the Beaumont. For 7 years, I had believed the worst thing my father could do was erase me from the family story. Standing there in my wedding dress, I realized I had been wrong. The family story itself was beginning to collapse. I did not sleep much on my wedding night. That sounds more dramatic than it was. Ethan and I were happy. We were married. We had survived my parents turning our ceremony into a public spectacle. And somewhere after midnight, when the last guests had left and the hotel room finally went quiet, I managed to laugh about the expression on my father's face when he recognized Ethan. But underneath the laughter was a sentence Douglas had left sitting between us like an unopened envelope. If this deal falls apart, we could lose the Beaumont. By 7 the next morning, my phone had already vibrated 6 times on the nightstand. 4 calls were from my father. 1 was from Erica. The last was a message from my mother. Family emergency. Call your father before you leave Charleston. I read it twice, then turned the phone face down. Ethan was standing near the window with 2 cups of coffee. He had already changed into jeans and a gray sweater, and there was something almost offensive about how normal he looked after the day we had just lived through. Your family? He asked. Apparently we have an emergency. Do you? I don't know. He handed me a cup. Do you want to find out? I looked at the suitcase near the door. 4 days in Savannah had been booked months earlier. Nothing extravagant. A small historic hotel, dinners we had already reserved, long walks, no schedules, no family. After the wedding, we were supposed to drive south and disappear for a while. For one dangerous minute, the old version of me started doing calculations. If the Beaumont was really in trouble, maybe 4 days mattered. Maybe I should stay. Maybe I could talk to Douglas. Maybe Ethan could make 1 phone call. Maybe postponing a honeymoon was a small sacrifice, compared with losing the place where my family had built most of its life. Then I caught myself. That was how it always started with the Bennetts. Nothing was ever described as surrender. It was one reasonable concession because the family needed you. Then another. Then another. Eventually you looked around and discovered your life had become a collection of things you had postponed for people who never postponed anything for you. I picked up my phone, opened the family thread, and muted it. We're going. Ethan nodded as if that was the only answer he had expected. I did not block anyone. I did not send an angry speech. I texted Erica that I would be back in Charleston in 4 days, and that if there was a genuine medical emergency, she could call Ethan's phone. Then I put my phone inside my bag. My father had taken enough of my wedding. He was not taking my honeymoon too. The drive to Savannah took a little over 2 hours once we were out of Charleston traffic. For the first 30 minutes, neither Ethan nor I mentioned Meridian, the Beaumont, or my father. We talked about the wedding cake we had barely eaten. My college friend who had danced until her shoes broke, and the fact that Ethan had somehow managed to leave his good tie at the venue. It almost worked. Then we stopped for coffee, and when Ethan came back to the car, I asked the question that had been growing in me since the night before. When did you know? He paused with one hand on the door. Know what? That the Beaumont was for sale. His expression changed just enough for me to know I had found the right question. Lorraine. When? He got into the car and closed the door. Meridian was approached as part of an exploratory process last year. It became serious enough for our investment team to start evaluating it later. You knew my family's hotel was being sold. I knew Bennett Heritage Hospitality was exploring a sale of the Beaumont. And you didn't tell me. No. I stared through the windshield. The strange thing was that I wasn't furious. I wanted to be. Anger would have been easier than the sharp feeling that came with discovering my husband had known something enormous about my family before I did. Ethan gave me a moment before continuing. I didn't initially connect the seller to you. Bennett isn't exactly a rare name. When our compliance team flagged the connection, I disclosed it and stepped away from the deal. When was that? A few weeks ago. And you still didn't tell me. I couldn't discuss a confidential transaction. I'm your wife. You weren't my wife then. I looked at him. That was a terrible answer. I know. Despite myself, I almost smiled. He reached for my hand but did not force me to take his. I should have told you that something involving your family had created a professional conflict for me. I could have said that without disclosing the transaction. I didn't because I thought your relationship with them was already painful enough, and I convinced myself that staying out of it meant keeping it away from you. That sounds uncomfortably familiar. I know that too. That was one of the reasons I loved Ethan. He did not become less intelligent when he was wrong. He did not turn a mistake into a courtroom argument he had to win. I finally took his hand. So, you're completely out? Yes. Meaning what? Meaning Olivia Grant is running the Meridian side. I don't receive the deal materials. I don't vote on it. I don't discuss valuation, offers, seller disclosures, or negotiations. If my father calls you, I send him back to the deal team. What if I ask? The answer stays the same. Part of me hated that. A larger part was relieved. My father had spent his entire career treating relationships as doors. If the front door was locked, he called a banker. If the banker failed, he found a board member. If that failed, he invited someone to dinner and tried again between the appetizer and dessert. Ethan's answer meant my marriage was not another door Douglas could use. I leaned back against the seat. So you can't tell me whether Meridian is walking away. No. You can't tell me what they're offering. No. You can't tell me whether Dad is exaggerating. No. I sighed. You're suddenly much less useful than he thinks you are. That's probably healthy for everyone. We continued driving. The conversation should have reassured me. Instead, it left me with the one person I had spent 7 years avoiding. Myself. Because if Ethan couldn't tell me what was happening with the Beaumont, I had to ask why hearing that it might be lost had frightened me so much. I had spent years saying I no longer cared about that building. I had become very good at saying it. Savannah was warm and bright when we arrived. The first 2 days passed slowly enough that my body finally understood the wedding was over. We walked until my feet hurt, ate too much, and spent an afternoon sitting beneath live oaks with nowhere else to be. I checked my phone once in the morning and once at night. My father called every day. My mother sent increasingly dramatic messages. Erica sent nothing after my reply. It was the silence from Erica that bothered me most. On our third evening, Ethan and I were walking back toward the hotel when we passed the lobby of an old building that had recently been restored. The front desk was polished dark wood, and behind it hung a row of decorative brass keys that no longer opened anything. I stopped. The smell reached me first. Beeswax, polish, and old wood. For half a second, Savannah disappeared. I was 16 again, standing behind the Beaumont's front desk, while my father placed a heavy brass key in my palm. One day, this place will be yours to protect. I still had that key. I had carried it in my wedding bag as my something old. And suddenly, I was thinking about the West Wing. 7 years earlier, I was 31 and still working for Bennett Heritage Hospitality. By then, I had already spent most of my adult life preparing to take a larger role in the company. I had studied architecture because I loved old buildings, but also because I understood that the Beaumont was not just a business to my father. It was religion. The West Wing had always been the awkward part of the property. Beautiful from the courtyard, difficult behind the walls. Old mechanical systems, moisture problems that had been patched more times than anyone liked to admit. Floor loading that had to be considered carefully if we wanted to change how the spaces were used. Preservation requirements that made every simple renovation more expensive. Douglas wanted to convert it into 24 luxury suites. On paper, it was brilliant. The Beaumont needed higher margin inventory. Charleston tourism was strong. The projected room rates looked excellent. Our consultants had built a beautiful model showing how quickly the renovation would pay for itself. My job was to determine whether the building could support the plan and what it would actually cost. The first answer was yes. The second answer was the problem. The West Wing could be renovated. It was not collapsing. It was not unsafe. There was no hidden catastrophe waiting behind a wall. But the real work required was far more expensive than the version my father had been presenting. Mechanical upgrades alone were substantial. Moisture remediation had spread further than expected. Several proposed layouts required structural reinforcement. Preservation requirements limited cheaper alternatives. By the time I completed the assessment, the realistic capital cost was close to twice the number being used in the redevelopment plan. I remember sitting across from Douglas in his office with the report between us. He did not shout when he first read it. That would have been easier. He flipped through the pages, went back to the executive summary, then looked at me. This is too alarmist. It isn't alarmist. You're presenting every risk as if it's guaranteed. I'm presenting the work we know we have to do. Costs change. So do construction schedules. We have contingencies. Not enough. He leaned back. My father's office overlooked the courtyard. From his desk, he could see the fountain, the restaurant terrace, and the old brick facade of the wing we were arguing about. He had spent his life learning how to make that view feel permanent. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "Revise the executive summary." "Which part?" "The tone." I knew exactly what he meant. He did not ask me to change measurements. He did not ask me to fabricate numbers. Douglas was too experienced to phrase things that way. He wanted the same facts arranged so that they sounded less dangerous. How? Lead with feasibility. The building supports redevelopment. Put the mitigation items in context. They are the context. Loren. Dad. His jaw tightened. This company cannot make major decisions every time a consultant gets nervous. I'm not a consultant. Then stop writing like one. That sentence stayed with me. I had spent years becoming qualified enough that my father would trust my judgment. The first time my judgment threatened something he wanted, my expertise became an inconvenience. He tapped the report. Bennett's don't make decisions under pressure. The numbers don't care whether we're Bennett's. Silence filled the office. I knew I had crossed a line before he spoke again. Maybe that was my first real mistake. Not because I was wrong, because I had still believed being right would matter. Over the next several days, the argument stopped being about the West Wing. It became about loyalty. My father said I was undermining confidence. My mother asked why I always had to make everything harder. Erica knew there was a dispute, but she was working on operations at the time and never sat in the meetings where the technical details were discussed. Then Douglas moved the redevelopment work away from me. More responsibility went to Erica and the business team. I interpreted that exactly the way an angry older sister would. He had chosen her. I resigned. That part of the story became cleaner in my memory every year afterward. Dad pushed me out. Erica took my place. I left. The truth was less flattering. I chose to leave. And after I left, I chose not to call my sister. Before my departure became final, Samuel Pierce, our chief financial officer at the time, handled the record transfer with legal and our outside advisors. Because I had authored technical assessments in my professional capacity, the exit memo allowed me to retain record copies of my own technical work and the correspondence transmitting those materials, provided I did not keep confidential financing documents, internal forecasts, or unrelated company records. It was boring paperwork. At the time, I barely cared. I placed my permitted professional files into an archive box when I moved offices and later took that box with me when I started consulting independently. I had not opened it in years. I never imagined it would matter again. What mattered more was the call I never made. I told myself Erica knew what happened. She didn't. I told myself she had chosen Dad. I never asked. By the time resentment hardened into family history, both of us were living inside versions of the same year that had never been compared. On our final night in Savannah, I told Ethan that part. Not the polished version. The true one. I should have called her. He did not immediately reassure me. That was another thing I appreciated about him. Probably, he said. I gave him a look. You could at least pretend to hesitate. You don't need me to tell you your father was right. He wasn't. You also don't need me to tell you every choice you made afterward was perfect. I looked out across the dark river. No, I suppose I don't. When we drove home the next morning, I felt better than I had expected. Not because the Beaumont was safe. I still had no idea what was happening with the sale. But I had decided something. If my family wanted my help, they would have to speak to me directly. No messages through Ethan. No guilt through Marianne. No assumptions about what I owed because my last name was Bennett. I unpacked that afternoon, started a load of laundry, and was standing in the kitchen trying to decide whether 4 days away justified ordering dinner instead of cooking when my phone rang. Erika. I stared at her name long enough that the call nearly went to voicemail. Then I answered. She did not return the greeting. What did you tell your husband about us? Her voice was controlled, but I knew my sister well enough to hear what sat underneath it. Fear. About what? Don't do that, Lauren. Do what? Pretend you don't know. I leaned against the counter. I genuinely don't. Meridian is reviewing the Beaumont. Dad has been trying to reach Ethan Mercer for months. Then suddenly you marry him. I closed my eyes. There it was. Not a question. A story. And I knew immediately who had written it. You think I knew about the sale. I think you knew more than you're admitting. I found out at my wedding. That's convenient. My hand tightened around the phone. 7 years earlier, I would have hung up. 7 years earlier, I would have decided that sentence proved Erica had chosen our father and there was nothing left to discuss. I forced myself to stay. Ethan is recused from the transaction. He doesn't discuss it with me. He didn't tell me the Beaumont was being sold. She was quiet. Then she said, Dad says Meridian wasn't a problem until you got involved. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. I could picture my father in his office, rearranging facts, the same way he had once wanted me to rearrange a technical report. Nothing had to be invented. It only had to be presented in the right order. I didn't get involved, I said. Then stay out of it. I am out of it. Good. Another pause. I should have let the call end. Instead, I asked, Erica, why are you selling the Beaumont? Her answer came too quickly. Because unlike you, some of us stayed to deal with reality. Then she hung up. I stood in my kitchen listening to the empty line. For 7 years, I had believed my sister resented me because Dad chose her. For the first time, I wondered if Erica had been taught to believe something completely different. Maybe she thought I was the one who had chosen to leave her behind. Erica called me again the next morning. This time, she did not accuse me of anything. She asked if I could meet her. We chose a coffee shop in Mount Pleasant that neither of us had any history with. Not the Beaumont, not our parents' house. Not one of the restaurants where our mother knew the owner and could somehow turn a private conversation into family news before dessert arrived. It was the kind of place where people worked on laptops, ordered one drink, and stayed for 2 hours without anyone caring who their father was. I arrived first. Erica came in 12 minutes late carrying a leather portfolio and 2 phones. Her hair was pulled into a low knot, and she was wearing the navy blazer she used whenever she wanted to look more composed than she felt. I had seen that armor before. She had worn versions of it since college. She looked tired. Not devastated. Not fragile. tired in the specific way competent people look when they have been solving too many problems without enough sleep. She sat across from me. I have 45 minutes. Good morning to you too. I'm sorry. That surprised me enough that I said nothing. She put one phone face down beside her coffee. I shouldn't have called you like that yesterday. You were angry. I'm still angry. At least we're making progress. Her mouth tightened. But I caught the beginning of a smile before she suppressed it. Then she leaned back. I need to understand what you know. About the sale? Yes. I know Dad wants to sell the Beaumont. I know Meridian is involved. I know Ethan recused himself before the wedding. That's it. You didn't know the hotel was on the market before Saturday? No. She watched me carefully. You expect me to believe Ethan never mentioned it? I expect you to believe he follows confidentiality rules. He's your husband. That doesn't make client information marital property. Erica looked down at her coffee. For a moment, I saw something shift. Not trust, but maybe the first crack in the certainty she had brought with her. We're not bankrupt, she said. I didn't say you were. Dad thinks that's what you believe. Dad thinks a lot of things on my behalf. She ignored that. The company is under pressure. That's different. What kind of pressure? She hesitated. I could almost hear the internal calculation. What could she tell me without crossing whatever line she had drawn around the transaction? Finally, she said, the Beaumont needs more capital than it generates right now. The refinance environment got worse. Insurance went up again. Labor costs are higher. Some of the property improvements we planned 3 years ago were delayed, which means they're more expensive now. That sounds like pressure. It is. It isn't collapse. I believe you. She looked almost irritated by that. Maybe she had prepared for me to gloat. I didn't. Whatever my relationship with my father had become, I had spent too many years inside hotel operations to enjoy hearing about vendors, staffing, insurance, and deferred work. Problems like that did not stay on spreadsheets. They landed on people. Erica rubbed one thumb against the edge of her cup. We've had vendors shorten payment terms. Some want deposits where they didn't before. We postponed the ballroom renovation again. We're watching overtime. We had an insurance renewal that came in ugly enough that Dad nearly threw the broker out of his office. That sounds like him. It wasn't funny. I didn't say it was. She exhaled. No, I know. There was a time when Erica and I could have had this conversation without measuring every word. Before we became the daughters our father compared to each other. Before I became the difficult one, and she became the dependable one. I asked, why sell instead of refinance? Because selling gives us options. That's not an answer. It is the answer I can give you. I nodded. That boundary was fair. I was not an employee. I was not a director. I was not entitled to confidential numbers because I had grown up running through the lobby. Then Erica said, the property is worth more to the right buyer than it is to us. Because of the brand? Partly. What else? She took a sip of coffee. Redevelopment upside. Something cold moved through me. What redevelopment? Her eyes lifted to mine. You know exactly what. The West Wing? Yes. For a few seconds, the room around us seemed louder. Grinder, milk steamer, chairs moving across tile. I kept my voice even. What are they assuming? About what? Capital cost. Erica's posture changed. There it was. The old reflex. Lauren is about to tell me I don't understand my own job. I don't know the engineering line items off the top of my head. I'm not asking for confidential numbers. I'm asking whether the current model assumes a full West Wing conversion. It assumes redevelopment potential. That can mean anything. It means the buyer sees value we aren't currently realizing. How many keys? Her expression hardened. Lauren, that's not an accusation. It sounds like one. I asked how many rooms. I'm not discussing the model with you. Fine. I leaned back. She watched me, waiting for the next argument. I let the silence sit. Finally, she said, you always do that. Do what? Ask questions like you already know the answer. I don't know the answer. You make people feel like they're failing a test. That landed. I wanted to tell her she was being defensive. Instead, I asked myself whether she was right. Sometimes she was. I'm sorry. She blinked. I don't mean that as a trick. I really don't know what the current assumptions are. Her shoulders lowered slightly. The West Wing is part of the upside case. That's all I'm comfortable saying. That's enough. Why? Because 7 years ago, that conversion only worked on paper if the capital budget stayed unrealistically low. Erica's face closed again. According to you. According to the assessment. Your assessment. Yes. Dad said it was overly conservative. He said a lot of things. Here we go. No, Erica, listen to me. I've been listening to this story for 7 years. What story? That Dad ignored the brilliant architect and destroyed your future because you were the only person brave enough to tell the truth. I stared at her. I have never said that. You didn't have to. What did he tell you? She sat back. For the first time since we had arrived, she looked less like the chief operating officer of Bennett Heritage Hospitality and more like my younger sister. He said you wanted to shut down the West Wing. I didn't. He said you refused to compromise. I refused to change the conclusion of a technical report because he didn't like what it cost. He said the building was fine. It was. That stopped her. What? The building was operable. It wasn't some death trap. I never said it was. Erica frowned. You wanted it closed? No. I said the redevelopment plan needed a different capital budget or a different scope. Her brow tightened. That is not what I was told. I'm beginning to understand that. She looked away. I continued carefully. The West Wing could be converted. That was never the issue. The problem was that Dad wanted 24 luxury suites on a number that didn't account for the actual mechanical work, moisture remediation, structural reinforcement, and preservation requirements we had already identified. He said you kept adding contingencies until the project became impossible. The contingencies were part of the work. He said when he moved the project away from you, you quit. That part is true. Erica looked back at me. So you did leave because I took over? No. You left right after Dad gave me more responsibility. I left because I no longer trusted what he wanted me to put my name behind. You didn't say that to me. No. You didn't say anything to me. My mouth went dry. There were arguments I had prepared for over the years. That was not one of them. Erica leaned toward me. You vanished, Lauren. I resigned. From the company. I'm talking about me. I looked at my hands. You were there. I thought you knew. How? I thought Dad told you. She laughed once, without humor. You trusted Dad to explain your side? When she put it that way, it sounded as foolish as it had been. No. Then what? I did not have a good answer. That was the problem with old anger. You could polish it until your choices looked inevitable. Then someone asked one simple question, and exposed the part you had avoided. I was hurt, I said. So was I. I thought you had chosen him. You never asked me. I know. You just decided. Yes. She stared at me. For once, I did not defend myself. Finally, Erica sat back. Do you know what he told me? I shook my head. He said you couldn't handle not being in charge. My chest tightened. He said the second I got real responsibility, you decided the company didn't deserve you anymore. He said you wanted everyone to choose between your way and the family. I almost interrupted. I stopped myself. Erica continued. And then you left. So from where I was standing, it looked true. That hurt because I could see the logic. Not the truth. The logic. My father had never needed to invent an entirely false story. He only needed to arrange real events in the most useful order. Lauren argued with Dad. Erica got more responsibility. Lauren resigned. Lauren stopped calling. Therefore, Lauren left because Erica replaced her. Clean. Simple. Wrong. I asked, why didn't you call me? Her expression sharpened. I did. I looked up. What? Twice. I tried to remember. 7 years was a long time, but some memories preserve themselves because shame knows where to store them. Then I remembered. One missed call the week after I resigned. Another 2 days later. I had seen Erica's name on my screen and let both calls go. I had told myself if she really cared, she would leave a message. She had not. At 31, I had interpreted silence as proof. At 38, sitting across from her, it looked more like two stubborn women waiting for the other one to bleed first. I remember, I said. Erica's eyes filled with something that was not quite anger anymore. You didn't call back. No. Why? Because I was angry. At me? At everyone. That's not the same thing. I know. She looked down. Neither of us apologized again. Not yet. We were not ready. Before we left, Erica glanced at her watch. I really do have to go. Okay. She gathered her portfolio. I asked, Erica, one more question. She stopped. Does the current sale package include any of my old West Wing work? I don't know. Would you know if it did? I reviewed the index. And? I don't remember seeing your name. That answer followed me home. I spent the afternoon working because I needed something ordinary to hold on to. I reviewed drawings for a courthouse restoration project, returned 2 client calls, and corrected a contractor's misunderstanding about window specifications. At 5:30, I opened a blank notebook. At the top of the first page, I wrote 3 headings. What I know, what I remember, what I need confirmed. Under what I know, I wrote that the Beaumont was being marketed, that the West Wing contributed to redevelopment value, that Meridian was one potential buyer, and that Ethan had no role in the transaction. Under what I remember, I wrote that my assessment had included multiple capital scenarios, that Samuel Pierce had received a copy, that Douglas had read it, that the project had been deferred rather than executed. Under what I need confirmed, I wrote one question. What information is the current valuation relying on? Then I stopped. I could have asked Ethan if the West Wing mattered to Meridian. I did not. I could have asked him whether the buyer had seen an engineering report. I did not. His recusal meant something only if I respected it too. Instead, I went to the storage cabinet in my office. The archive box was on the bottom shelf. My name was written across the side in faded marker. Underneath it was the date of my departure from Bennett Heritage. I pulled it out and set it on the floor. The exit records were on top, copies of the professional file retention memo. My archive index. A list of the technical documents I had been permitted to retain when I left. I found the West Wing project number halfway down the second page. Assessment. Transmittal correspondence. Supporting technical notes. I did not open the report. Not yet. I sat back on my heels and looked at the box. There was a dangerous temptation in finding old evidence. It made you want to turn memory into certainty before you understood the current facts. I was not going to do that. 7 years earlier, I had left because I believed my father wanted me to make a professional conclusion softer than I thought it should be. That did not automatically mean the current sale was improper. Buildings changed. Costs changed. Reports aged. I needed to know what Erica had actually been asked to certify before I decided anything had gone wrong. So I put the lid back on the box. At 8 that evening, Erica called. Her voice sounded different. Less angry. More focused. I checked something. What? The diligence request. I walked into my home office and closed the door. What about it? You asked whether I would know if your report was in the data room. Yes, I should. That sentence tightened every muscle in my shoulders. What exactly does that mean? The buyer asked for engineering, capital planning, redevelopment feasibility, and deferred maintenance material related to the West Wing. How far back? 10 years. I looked toward the archive box. My assessment was 7 years old. And you certified the response? Yes. I did not speak. Erica continued quickly. Legal and finance compiled the index. Different departments uploaded material. I reviewed the final index and signed the seller certificate as COO after executive review. What did the certificate say? It wasn't some guarantee that every piece of paper ever created was there. I didn't ask that. I know. She paused. It said the data room contained all known material reports and analyses in the requested categories that were in the company's possession or control. I sat down. West Wing engineering? Yes. Redevelopment feasibility? Yes. Capital planning? Yes. And deferred maintenance? Yes. My assessment belonged to more than one of those categories. I kept my voice steady. Did you see anything authored by me? I don't remember. Erika. I said I don't remember. You reviewed the index. There were hundreds of files. I understand. No, you don't. I wasn't sitting there thinking about you. I was checking departments, dates, document types, whether counsel had follow-up questions. Your name was not some flashing warning sign in my head. I'm not blaming you. It feels like you are. I'm trying to understand what you signed. She went quiet. Then she said, I checked the index again. My fingers tightened around the pen in front of me. And? I didn't find your name. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I looked at the closed archive box across the room. 7 years ago, my father had told me my assessment was too conservative. Now the hotel was being valued partly on the same redevelopment opportunity that assessment had analyzed. And my sister had signed a certification stating that the buyer had received all known material reports in that category. I still did not know whether anything improper had happened. But for the first time, the problem was no longer only my father's deal. My sister's name was on it. I asked carefully, Erica, what exactly did you certify was complete? Erica did not answer my question immediately. I could hear her breathing through the phone, and beneath it, the faint clicking of a keyboard. I certified that the data room contained all known material reports in the categories the buyer requested, she said finally. Engineering, capital planning, redevelopment feasibility, deferred maintenance, 10 years back, specifically for the West Wing. And my assessment would fall under that, if it says what you claim it says. I closed my eyes. There was the Erica I remembered, not quite calling me a liar, just leaving the door open. It does. Then bring it. To where? The Beaumont. I looked across my office at the archive box. You want me to come back there? I want to know whether we have a real problem or whether you're remembering a 7-year-old argument as something bigger than it was. My first instinct was to refuse. The Beaumont had not needed me for 7 years. I had built a business without it. I had gotten married without it. I had learned how to drive past Meeting Street without looking toward the block where half my childhood still seemed to live behind tall windows. Going back felt dangerously close to stepping into an old role. Then I reminded myself why Erica had called. Her name was on the certification. This was no longer about proving I had been right in 2019. I'll come tomorrow, I said. But I'm not joining the sale process. I didn't ask you to, and I'm not talking to Dad unless I choose to. That may be difficult. That's his problem. Erica Sahil, 10 tomorrow morning. Fine. After we hung up, I stood beside the archive box for several minutes without opening it. I could have pulled the report that night. I could have read every page, found every warning, and arrived at the Beaumont armed for war. I deliberately did not. I wanted to see what existed now before I let a 7-year-old document tell me what I expected to find. The next morning, I parked 2 blocks away. There was valet parking at the Beaumont, of course. There had always been valet parking, but I could not make myself hand my keys to a young man in a Bennett Heritage jacket and walk through the front entrance like I belonged there. So I walked. The building appeared at the end of the block exactly as it always had, which was almost insulting. 3 stories of old brick and pale stone, tall windows, black iron balconies, a courtyard hidden behind an arched passage. Tourists passed in front carrying shopping bags and paper cups, unaware that I had spent half my life believing that building was my future. The brass key was in my coat pocket. I had moved it there from my wedding bag without really thinking about it. As I approached the doors, my fingers closed around it. Heavy, cold, useless. The doors opened before I touched them. A bellman smiled automatically. Good morning. Then he looked at me again. His smile changed. Miss Bennett? I almost corrected him. Mrs. Mercer. Then I realized I did not want my first act inside the Beaumont to be explaining my marital status to a man whose name I did not know. Lauren is fine. He nodded quickly. Welcome back. The words hit harder than they should have. I stepped into the lobby. The smell was first. Wood polish, coffee, fresh flowers, a trace of lemon cleaner from the marble floors. Memory did not arrive politely. I saw myself at 12, sitting behind the concierge desk with algebra homework. At 19, home from college, helping move flower arrangements before a wedding. At 28, standing beside my father while he introduced me to a group of investors as the daughter who would someday understand the building better than he did. Then a service cart rattled across the marble, and the present returned. The Beaumont looked beautiful. That mattered. No sagging ceiling, no buckets catching leaks, no cracked plaster falling onto guests. People were checking in. A couple sat near the fireplace comparing maps. 2 employees carried luggage toward the elevators. The hotel was alive. Erica came down the main staircase with a tablet tucked under one arm. She was wearing black trousers and a cream blouse, and her expression was so formal I almost smiled. "You came. You invited me." Her eyes moved briefly to my coat pocket when I pulled my hand away from the brass key. "Do you still carry that thing?" "Apparently. Dad gave me one too." That surprised me. "When?" "When he put me in operations." Of course he had. For one petty second, I hated that. Then, I hated myself for caring. Erica seemed to read enough of my face to understand where my mind had gone. "Mine is in a drawer somewhere. Probably healthier." She almost smiled. Then the wall came back up. "Legal knows you're here." I told them you're not reviewing deal documents. I'm showing you physical areas and limited technical excerpts related to the West Wing. Good. No photos of internal logs, no forwarding anything, no discussing the buyer. I know how confidentiality works. I know you do. The fact that she said it without sarcasm felt strangely significant. We started through the lobby. I had expected Erica to take me directly upstairs, but she walked me through the public spaces first. Restaurant, ballroom corridor, courtyard. Some things had changed. Some had not. The furniture was newer, the lighting warmer. The old concierge desk had been moved 6 feet to improve traffic flow, which annoyed me for reasons I could not justify. "You hate it," Erica said. "The desk?" "Yes. It ruins the axis." She gave me a look. "You've been here 4 minutes. It still ruins the axis." For a moment, we were sisters again. Then we reached the West Wing. The transition was subtle. Guests probably would not have noticed. I did. The carpet changed first. Then the ceiling height. The mechanical hum behind the walls became slightly louder. An access panel near the service corridor had newer paint around its edges. Erica unlocked a staff door. "You're allowed in here because council said physical observation is fine as long as we stay out of active contractor areas. I appreciate the permission." "You're welcome." We entered a service corridor behind the guest rooms. I slowed automatically. The old part of my brain took over. Not emotional memory. Professional memory. I looked at baseboards, access panels, ceiling penetrations, plumbing chases, patched plaster. There was an old brown stain on one section of ceiling. I stopped. Erica noticed. That was a leak from an HVAC condensate line last summer. "Fixed?" "Yes." "Above?" "Replaced." I stepped closer but did not touch it. The stain was old and dry. Farther down, part of the wall had clearly been opened and patched. What was that? "Pipe replacement." "When?" 2 years ago. We passed scaffolding folded against one wall near a locked service zone. I looked at her. "Before you ask, exterior masonry inspection." I wasn't going to ask. "You were absolutely going to ask." I smiled despite myself. Then we reached a mechanical room. The equipment inside was not ancient, but it was not new either. Some components had been replaced. Others clearly remained from earlier upgrade cycles. Patchwork. Not negligence. Not disaster. Patchwork. I remembered how easy it would have been for me to walk into that corridor, already convinced Dad had ignored everything I wrote and interpret every stain as proof. I was not going to do that. "Is the wing operating normally?" I asked. "Yes." "Current inspections?" "Passed." "Any rooms offline because of structural issues?" "No." "Any active life safety problems?" "No." I nodded. Erica crossed her arms. "You sound disappointed." I looked at her. "No, I'm relieved." She did not seem to expect that answer. I never wanted this place to fail. That isn't how it felt. "I know." We continued. Near the end of the corridor, I noticed an access door with a recent moisture remediation sticker. What happened there? "Water intrusion after heavy rain." Exterior seal failed around an old window assembly. How extensive? 3 rooms affected. Interior finishes removed. Masonry dried. Seal repaired. Any framing damage? Minimal. Report? Yes. I glanced at her. Current data room? I'm not answering that from memory. Fair. Erica stopped walking. Lauren, this is what I mean. What? You see one remediation sticker, and suddenly we're back in 2019. I asked questions. You look like you'd found a body. That's not fair. Neither is showing up after 7 years and acting like every repair proves you were right. I took a breath. The old version of me would have matched her tone. Instead, I looked back down the corridor. You're right about one thing. Repairs don't prove I was right. She waited. The hotel is operating. That matters. If current inspections are clean and the repairs were done properly, I have no basis to say this building is unsafe. Her arms loosened. But, she said, but operating safely today is not the same question as whether converting this wing into luxury suites can be done cheaply. Her expression tightened again. There it is. It's a different question. Dad says you always move the goalposts. I'm not moving anything. Existing operations and redevelopment economics are separate issues. You haven't even seen the current numbers. Exactly. She stared at me for another second. Then she said, "Come upstairs." We went to a small conference room on the administrative floor. A woman from outside council was waiting for us. I recognized her name from Erica's message, but had never met her. Lauren, Erica said, "This is Megan Holt." Megan shook my hand. Erica explained the situation. Just to be clear, you are not being brought into the transaction. We're allowing you to review selected technical excerpts because you authored historical work that may relate to the diligence request. Understood. No pricing. No bidder information. No negotiation materials. Fine. Megan turned a laptop toward me. On screen was a technical redevelopment summary with certain sections extracted from a larger report. No buyer name. No offer. No valuation. Just scope. I read slowly. Proposed room conversion. Mechanical assumptions. Moisture remediation allowance. Structural modification. Historic preservation contingency. Estimated capital expenditure. My stomach tightened. Not because the numbers were identical to 2019. They were not. They were higher, but not nearly as much higher as I expected after 7 years. I scrolled back. What year is the base mechanical estimate from? Erica looked at Megan. Megan said, "The seller-side technical consultant updated portions of the model last year. Portions? That's what we're trying to determine." I pointed to one line. "This allowance assumes targeted mechanical replacement." Erica nodded. Yes. In 2019, the conversion scope pushed us toward broader system work because 24 higher-end suites changed loads and distribution requirements. The current plan isn't identical. I can see that. I moved down. Moisture allowance is still light. You don't know current condition. No. Which is why I'm not saying the number is wrong. I'm saying I would want a current engineer to test it. Erica leaned back. So, that's your conclusion? My conclusion is that I don't have enough current information to reach a conclusion. She looked almost offended. You dragged me into this to say you don't know? I didn't drag you anywhere. You called me. Megan hid a smile behind her hand. I continued. If the buyer is competent, they'll have their own technical review. Let them test the assumptions. They are doing diligence. Good. I looked at Erica. You don't need to believe me. You don't even need to believe the 2019 report. You need current engineering. For the first time that morning, she did not argue. I returned to the summary. The problem was not that the assumptions were absurd. That would have been simpler. They were plausible enough to pass at a glance. That made them more dangerous if the underlying conditions did not support them. I asked Megan, the diligence request Erica certified, did it specifically cover historical redevelopment feasibility work? Yes. And material engineering reports related to West Wing capital planning? Yes. 10 years? Yes. He sat back. Erica looked at me. Show me what you remember. So I did. Not the report itself. My memory. I told her about the 2019 feasibility process. The mechanical scope. The moisture findings. The structural loading issues tied to proposed layouts. The preservation constraints. The final range, coming in close to twice the early planning number. Erica listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Dad told me you wanted a complete shutdown. I told you that wasn't true. He said you presented the West Wing like it was failing. I didn't. He said you walked into a meeting, put a report on the table, and told him the project was dead." I remembered the meeting. Not perfectly. Memory is dishonest when you ask it for dialogue after 7 years. But I remembered enough. I said the project did not work at the budget he was using. That sounds different. It is different. He said when he asked for options, you refused. I gave options. What options? Reduce suite count. Phase mechanical work. Change the room mix. Increase capital. Delay until financing improved. Erica frowned. He never told me that. What did he tell you? That you gave him one impossible number and expected him to accept it. I shook my head. That's not what happened. You're sure? The question irritated me. Then I stopped. You're allowed to ask that. She looked surprised. I'm not asking you to accept my memory over his. That would be stupid. Then what are we doing? Finding the records. Megan nodded. That's the correct answer. Erica looked between us. I continued. My permitted archive includes the final assessment and the correspondence transmitting it. If the company still has its own copy, your index should show it. If it doesn't, we need to understand why. Erica's jaw tightened. You keep saying if? Because I'm trying very hard not to accuse anyone before we have evidence. That silenced her. After lunch, she took me to the records office on the administrative floor. I did not touch the secure archive system. Erica logged in herself, while Megan remained beside us. The search categories matched the diligence request. Engineering reports, capital improvement studies, redevelopment feasibility, deferred maintenance, West Wing, date range 10 years. Erica searched my surname. Nothing. She searched the project number I remembered. Nothing. She searched variations of the old internal title. Nothing. My pulse began to climb. Try feasibility, I said. Several documents appeared. None were mine. Mechanical upgrade study? A newer report. Not mine. Historic preservation impact? 3 files. Not mine. Erica stopped typing. This doesn't prove anything. I know. It could have been archived under another project number. Yes. Or replaced by later work. Yes. Or maybe your final report was never formally issued. I looked at her. It was. You're sure? Yes. How? Because I transmitted it myself. To Dad? To Dad and Samuel Pierce. The old CFO. Yes. Megan turned toward me. Do you still have that correspondence under your permitted archive? I believe so. Erica leaned back from the computer. The confidence she had carried into the hotel that morning was fading. Not disappearing. Fading. I reviewed this index, she said quietly. I know. I signed after executive review. I know. Her eyes stayed on the screen. If your report was material and the company had it, it should be here. Yes. What exactly was it called? I gave her the title as closely as I remembered. West Wing Redevelopment Assessment. She typed it slowly. No result. The 3 of us sat in silence. I did not feel victorious. That surprised me. For years, I had imagined what it would be like if Erica finally discovered Dad had lied about something important. I had pictured satisfaction. Instead, I saw my younger sister staring at a screen containing her own professional risk, her signature, her responsibility. I said, "We still don't know enough." She looked at me sharply. "You think it exists. I know my copy exists. Then why didn't you bring it?" Because I wanted to see what was here before I walked in waving a 7-year-old document like a weapon. Megan nodded slightly. That was wise. Erica stood and began pacing. If you have it, we need to compare it against the request. Yes. And against current reports. Yes. And legal needs to determine whether it was in company possession or control when I signed. Yes. She stopped. You're enjoying making me say all of this. No. She searched my face. Whatever she saw there must have convinced her. She sat again. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Erica said, I remember the week you left. I waited. You came out of Dad's office carrying a folder. You were furious. I asked what happened. I remember. You said, ask him. I closed my eyes briefly. That sounded exactly like me at 31. What did he tell you? That you wanted the company to choose between your professional ego and the hotel. I let out a slow breath. I'm sorry I told you to ask him. That isn't an apology for leaving. No. Her eyes met mine. I'm not ready to give you that one in a hallway because we found a missing file. Something in her expression softened. Barely. Good. I almost laughed. She continued. I don't want some dramatic sister reunion because Dad might have hidden a report. Neither do I. And I'm still angry at you. I know. But if this report is what you say it is. She stopped. I waited for her to finish. She didn't. Megan closed the laptop. I suggest we reconvene after Lauren retrieves her permitted copy. Until then, no conclusions. Erica nodded. We walked back toward the lobby together. At the staircase, she stopped beside one of the tall windows overlooking the courtyard. Guests were drinking afternoon tea below us. A waiter moved between tables carrying champagne. Everything looked calm. The Beaumont had always been good at looking calm. Erica said, You know what Dad told me after you left? What? He said some people love buildings more than they love families. I looked at her. He told me the opposite. Her brow furrowed. What do you mean? He said if I really loved the family, I would stop treating the Beaumont like an academic exercise and help him protect it. We stood there, absorbing the symmetry. Same father, same conflict. 2 daughters. 2 different stories. Erica looked away first. I have meetings. I'll send nothing by email until Megan tells me how she wants the copy handled. Good. I started down the stairs. Lauren. I turned. Her face had lost the hostility it wore when I arrived. What replaced it was worse. Uncertainty. You said the final assessment was transmitted. Yes. And Samuel had it. Yes. And Dad. Yes. She swallowed. Then she asked the question I had been waiting for since the moment she called me. What assessment? Erica's question stayed with me all the way home. Not because I doubted the answer, but because 7 years earlier I had assumed she knew enough about the West Wing dispute to understand why I left. Sitting in my car outside my office that afternoon, I finally admitted how much of my anger had been built on that assumption. I had blamed Erica for choosing our father without ever checking whether he had given her enough information to make a choice at all. That did not erase the years she had spent defending him, and it did not erase my own resentment, but it changed what I needed to do next. I could not walk back into her life with an accusation. I needed facts clean enough that neither of us would have to rely on memory. The archive box was exactly where I had left it. I carried it to the conference table in my office and placed my departure paperwork beside it before touching anything else. The exit memo was dry, legal language from 2019, but that boring document mattered now. It listed the technical materials I had been permitted to retain as professional record copies when I left Bennett Heritage Hospitality. No financing packages, no internal forecasts, no board materials, only work I had authored and the correspondence transmitting it. The West Wing project appeared on the index with the same internal number I had given Erica at the Beaumont. I read the authorization twice before opening the folder. If I was going to ask questions about someone else's process, mine needed to be clean too. The assessment was thicker than I remembered. For years it had existed in my mind as a single argument with my father, but the actual document was more disciplined than my memory. Floor plans, mechanical notes, moisture findings, preservation constraints, structural observations, capital ranges, phasing options. I found the executive summary and forced myself to read it from the first sentence, instead of jumping to the paragraph I remembered best. The first conclusion was exactly what I had told Erica. Redevelopment was feasible. That mattered. I had not declared the West Wing unusable. I had not recommended abandoning it. I had not written that the Beaumont was unsafe or that the project should die. The report said the proposed luxury suite conversion could proceed if the scope budget, and schedule were revised to reflect the actual work required. The second conclusion was also what I remembered. The preliminary capital budget being used at the time was materially insufficient. I kept reading. Some of the assumptions were obviously dated. Construction pricing had changed, mechanical equipment had changed, Charleston's hotel market had changed, even preservation guidance had evolved in some areas. There were contingencies in my estimate that another architect might reasonably have handled differently. I marked those pages with yellow tabs. Then I marked the things that were not opinions. Existing system limitations. Moisture remediation known at the time. Structural work triggered by certain proposed room layouts. Preservation restrictions that eliminated cheaper alternatives. Those were conditions a current consultant could reassess, but they were not inventions. I opened a notebook and divided a page into 2 columns. What this proves. What this does not prove. Under the first, I wrote that a formal West Wing redevelopment assessment existed in 2019, that it concluded redevelopment was possible but more expensive than the original plan, and that the issues fell directly within the categories the buyer had requested for the last 10 years. Under the second, I wrote that the report did not prove current conditions were identical, did not prove the current seller model was wrong, did not prove anyone deliberately withheld the document, and did not prove the current transaction was improper. That distinction calmed me. Suspicion was emotional. Evidence had limits. Near the back of the folder, I found the transmittal email. I remembered sending it. I had forgotten the exact wording. From Lauren Bennett to Douglas Bennett, Samuel Pierce. Subject: Final West Wing Redevelopment Assessment. The body was painfully ordinary. Final assessment attached. Revised cost ranges incorporated. Key feasibility findings summarized on pages 4 through 7. Available to discuss phasing alternatives. No accusation. No dramatic warning. No secret message. Just work. The timestamp showed it had been sent on a Tuesday morning in September 2019. The attachment name matched the document in my file exactly. I stared at my father's email address. For 7 years, Douglas had described that period as if I had stormed out with a private opinion no one else had accepted. He had received the report. So had Samuel Pierce, then our chief financial officer. That still did not tell me what happened to the company's copy after I left. Files were migrated, systems changed, studies were superseded, archives were reorganized. A missing document could have a dozen explanations that were not malicious. I called Erica. I found it. She did not ask what I meant. Does it say what you remembered? Yes. A pause followed. Exactly? No. That caught her attention. What's different? Nothing important about the basic conclusion. But I want to be precise. Some cost assumptions are 7 years old. There are contingencies Dad could reasonably have disagreed with. It proves what we knew then. It does not prove what the building needs now. Erica was quiet for a moment. Thank you for saying that. I'm not trying to win an argument from 2019. Then what are you trying to do? Figure out why something that appears to fall inside the buyer's 10-year request isn't in the index you certified. Her voice hardened slightly. You still think it should have been there. I think council should decide that, not me. Another pause. Then she said, Megan wants to see it. We arranged a controlled review 2 days later at the Beaumont. I did not email the assessment to Erica. I did not attach it to a family thread or send it from my personal account to anyone connected to the transaction. I brought the professional record copy in a folder, along with the exit memo that documented my right to possess it. Megan met us in the same conference room we had used before, and began with the retention paperwork rather than the report itself. This is useful, she said after reading the memo. It establishes provenance. Erica looked at her. Meaning? Meaning Lauren isn't producing a document she shouldn't have. I appreciated the sentence more than I expected. Megan then checked the file name, date, project number, and transmittal email. She did not treat any of it like a courtroom reveal. She treated it like a lawyer trying to determine whether an old document belonged in a current diligence response. When she finished the executive summary, she looked at Erica. This fits more than one category in the request. Erica's face tightened. Even at 7 years old? The buyer specifically asked for 10 years. Could we treat it as superseded? Possibly. But if so, I would expect the response to identify it as a historical study and explain that more current work supersedes it. Would we have been required to upload the entire thing? That depends on the request language and how we interpreted materiality. But pretending it never existed would not be my preferred response. Erica looked toward me. I kept my mouth shut. She turned back to Megan. Does this mean my certification was false? No. Erica's shoulders lowered only slightly. Megan continued. It means we need to understand what information was available when the certificate was prepared, who made the materiality decisions, whether this report remained in the company's possession or control, and what later work may have superseded it. Your certificate was based on a process. We need to examine that process before deciding whether it requires correction. That was the response of a professional. Not panic. Not absolution. A process. Erica looked at the report again. What exactly did Lauren say in 2019? Megan glanced at me. You can read it. Erica did. I watched her face as she moved through the executive summary. I knew the paragraphs almost by memory now. Feasible redevelopment. Revised capital requirement. Mechanical scope. Moisture remediation. Structural modification. Preservation impacts. Alternative phasing. When she finished, she turned back several pages and read them again. He told me you wanted to close the wing. I know. This doesn't say that. No. He told me you thought the whole project was reckless. I thought the budget was reckless. That isn't the same thing. No. She set the document down. For years, I had imagined hearing my sister say something like that. I had thought it would feel like vindication. It didn't. It felt like watching someone realize the floor under her had been built by the same person who had convinced her it was solid. Megan pulled up the buyer's diligence request on her laptop. She read the relevant section aloud. Historical and current engineering studies, redevelopment feasibility analyses, capital planning materials, deferred maintenance assessments, and related material reports concerning the West Wing, covering the preceding 10 years. Then she opened the data room index. We searched again. Project number. Title. My name. Samuel Pierce. Nothing. There was no notation that the 2019 assessment had been superseded. No line identifying it as historical. No cross-reference to a later study. Erica folded her arms. Who compiled this section? Facilities supplied documents, Megan said. Finance added capital materials. The technical consultant added current work. Legal built the response index from what was provided. And executive review? Your father reviewed the seller package at the executive level before your certification. Erica's eyes lifted. Reviewed what? The final index and response categories. Did he certify completeness? No, you did, as coup. There was no accusation in Megan's tone. That made the sentence worse. Erica looked at the certification itself. I had seen her signature before on birthday cards, checks, internal memos when we still worked together. Here, it sat beneath several paragraphs of corporate language stating that, to the best of the company's knowledge after reasonable inquiry, the listed materials represented the known material documents responsive to the specified categories. Her name. Not mine. I said it softly. That's your name, not mine. Erica looked at me sharply. I can see that. I'm not attacking you. It sounds like it. What I mean is you need advice that protects you, not Dad, not me, not the sale. You signed it. Her expression changed. The anger did not disappear, but it became more focused. You think I need my own lawyer? I think Megan should tell you what you need. Megan answered before Erica could. At minimum, you need to understand your obligations separately from whatever business preference your father has. If facts change, or responsive information is located, the diligence response can be supplemented. What matters now is that nobody makes a correction decision based on family dynamics. Erica gave a humorless laugh. That may be the first impossible thing anyone has said in this room. Megan did not smile. I'm serious. So am I. We spent another hour reconstructing the document trail. The company's current archive system had been implemented after I left. Some older folders had been migrated from a shared drive. Others had been scanned from paper files. Samuel Pierce had retired years earlier. His mailbox had been archived, but no one wanted to start searching everything indiscriminately without knowing what they were looking for. My transmittal gave them that. Date. Recipients. Attachment name. Project number. Megan asked Records Management to preserve the relevant archive and search those terms. Then Erica remembered the board minutes. Dad took the West Wing plan to the board that fall. I looked at her. You were there? No. I wasn't a director then. But I remember because the project disappeared from the Capitol calendar afterward. Megan searched the corporate minute index. The 2019 meeting packet was restricted, so she accessed it through council credentials while Erica and I waited. She found the entry 3 meetings after the date on my assessment. West Wing redevelopment deferred pending revised capital plan. That was all. 1 line. No mention of me. No accusation. No reason. But it mattered. The issue had not existed only inside my office or inside an argument with Douglas. It had reached governance level. A redevelopment plan had been deferred because the capital plan needed revision. Erica read the sentence several times. He told me the board deferred it because you left. I was still employed when that meeting happened. She looked at the date. The board meeting had taken place 9 days before my resignation became effective. Erica leaned back slowly. I did not say anything. I did not need to. Megan made another note. This corroborates that a capital issue existed at the time. It still doesn't tell us what happened to the report itself. What about Samuel? Erica asked. We can contact him if necessary, Megan said. But we don't need to turn him into the center of this. The transmittal email shows he received the file. The minutes show the project was deferred pending a revised capital plan. That is already enough to justify determining whether the company retained the assessment and whether it should have been included or identified. I appreciated that too. No magical retired executive appearing with a perfect memory. No witness writing in to settle 7 years of family history. Documents first. People second. Erica stood and walked to the window. The courtyard below was busy with lunch service. You know what the worst part is? I waited. I signed that certificate because Dad told me I was the person he trusted to run the process. I could have said something cruel. I could have reminded her that she had spent 7 years treating that trust as proof she was the daughter who stayed, the daughter who understood business, the daughter who did not run away when decisions became difficult. Instead, I said, "You signed because it was your job." She turned around. Is that supposed to make me feel better? No, it's supposed to make the next decision clearer. What next decision? If the response is incomplete, fix it. And if fixing it hurts the sale? That isn't the same question. She stared at me. I recognized the look because I had once worn it in my father's office. The moment you understood that professional responsibility was about to collide with family expectation. Easy for you to say, she said. No. Yes, Lauren, it is. You left. You built your own company. You don't have 200 employees wondering whether there's going to be a buyer or a lender watching our numbers or vendors calling me every day. That doesn't change what you signed. I know. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she turned away. I gave her a minute. Then I said, I'm not telling you to blow up the deal. I'm telling you not to let anyone make you responsible for information they didn't give you. She looked at me over her shoulder. Anyone? I knew what she was asking. Dad included. She looked back out the window. Megan closed the laptop. I'm going to request the original archive search and identify the review trail for the seller response. Until we have that, no one should characterize this as intentional concealment. I haven't, I said. Erica nodded. I haven't either. That mattered. We were both angry. Neither of us was allowed to substitute anger for proof. The archive search took 3 days. I went back to work. For those 3 days, I did not call Erica for updates. I did not ask Ethan anything about Meridian. I did not tell friends what was happening. My parents called twice. I let both calls go to voicemail. Douglas's first message said, I understand you've been spending time at the hotel. Call me. The The second said, "Do not interfere in company business you left 7 years ago." I saved both messages and did nothing with them. The fact that he knew I had been there was not surprising. The Beaumont had never been a place where Douglas failed to hear when something unusual happened. What interested me was what he did not say. He did not ask why I was there. He did not ask whether I had found something. He told me not to interfere. On the third afternoon, Erica texted me. "Megan found the review trail. Come at 4. When I entered the conference room, the atmosphere was different. There were more documents on the table, but no one looked triumphant. Megan had located the old archive entry, showing that my assessment had once existed on the company's legacy server. During migration, the folder had been preserved in a restricted historical project archive rather than the active redevelopment directory. That explained why Erica had not seen it in the normal search. It did not explain the diligence response. The current seller process had included an executive-level review of historical West Wing materials. Someone had identified multiple older files as outdated and excluded them from the buyer-facing index rather than listing them as superseded. My assessment was among them. Erica read the review notation. "Who made that call?" Megan answered carefully. "The initial historical material review appears to have been done by finance and executive management. Legal relied on the responsive set delivered to us. Names. Your father signed off on the category review." The room went very quiet. I asked, "Does that prove he intentionally hid this specific report?" "No," Megan said. "It proves he participated in the decision that certain historical material would not be included. We still need his explanation of how he evaluated this assessment and whether he considered it responsive or material." Erica picked up the copy of my report. "Then ask him." Megan looked toward the door. I already did. As if the timing had been planned for effect, the door opened. My father walked in. Douglas did not look at me first. He looked at Erica. "What is this about?" She held up the report. The moment his eyes landed on the cover, his face changed. Not surprise. Recognition. That one reaction answered a question neither Erica nor I had yet asked aloud. He knew exactly what she was holding. "Where did you get that?" "Lauren retained an authorized professional copy," Megan said. "We're reviewing whether it fell within the buyer's historical diligence request." My father's gaze moved to me. "You brought this into the sale?" "I brought it to counsel." "That is not what I asked." "It's the answer you're getting." He crossed the room and looked down at the report as if it were something unpleasant someone had left on his table. Erica did not move. "You knew this existed." "Of course I knew it existed." Her face went still. Douglas seemed to realize too late what he had just confirmed. He recovered quickly. "That doesn't make it relevant." "The request covered 10 years, Erica said. "It's obsolete." "Then why wasn't it listed as obsolete?" "Because we are not required to bury a buyer under every failed study anyone has ever written." "It wasn't a failed study." My father looked at me. This is exactly why she should not be involved." I almost answered. Erica spoke first. "This isn't about Lauren." Douglas turned toward her. "It became about Lauren the moment she walked back into this building carrying a report she wrote 7 years ago. I signed the certification. You signed what legal prepared." Megan intervened. "Douglas, that isn't quite accurate. Legal prepared the certificate based on responsive materials supplied through the company review process." He gave her a cold look. "I know how the process works." "Then you understand why we need to document the basis for excluding this assessment." His patience snapped. "The basis is that it was outdated before the market even had time to prove it wrong." I watched Erica. She was no longer looking at me. She was looking only at him. "Did you read it before you approved the historical material review?" Douglas exhaled sharply. "I read it in 2019. "That's not what I asked." "Erica, we have a serious buyer, a narrow window, and employees depending on us. I am not going to let Lauren walk in here after 7 years and poison the deal with old paper because she needs to prove she was right." Erica's hand tightened around the report. If it was irrelevant, the buyer could have been told it was superseded. The buyer does not need help inventing reasons to lower the price. There it was. Not a confession. Not fraud. Something more believable. My father had decided that because he considered the report outdated, The buyer did not deserve to decide whether it mattered. And because he was Douglas Bennett, he had assumed his judgment could stand in for everyone else's. Erica looked down at her own signature on the certification, then back at him. "You let me sign this without telling me the report existed." His expression hardened. "I let you do your job." "No. You decided what I was allowed to know before I did it." "That is not what happened." "Then explain what happened." Douglas looked at the assessment again. His face settled into the expression I remembered from 2019, the one that said the discussion should already be over because he had decided it was. He put 2 fingers on the cover and pushed it away from him. That thing was obsolete before the ink dried. My father said it with such certainty that, for a moment, the conference room felt exactly like his office in 2019. Same tone, same impatience, same assumption that once Douglas Bennett had decided what mattered, everyone else's job was to accept the decision and move on. The difference was Erica. 7 years earlier, she had not been in the room where he challenged my assessment. She had only heard what happened afterward. Now she was standing 3 feet from him with the report in her hand, and her own signature attached to the seller certification it had been left out of. "Obsolete how?" she asked. Douglas looked at her as if the question disappointed him. "The market changed. Construction costs changed. The project changed. We have operated this hotel for 7 years since Lauren wrote that report, and despite the way she likes to tell the story, the West Wing did not fall into the street. I never said it would." He turned to me. "You treated every possible problem like a certainty." "No, I priced the work we knew the conversion would require. You priced fear. I priced construction." Megan shifted slightly beside the conference table, but I raised one hand. I did not need a lawyer to referee an argument I had already had 7 years earlier, and I was not going to have it again. "You're right about one thing," I said. Douglas looked almost suspicious. "The hotel didn't collapse. It's still operating. I walked the West Wing myself. I never said the building was a death trap, and the report doesn't say that either." Erica's eyes moved toward me. I continued. "The question is whether the redevelopment assumptions being used now were independently refreshed, and whether a report that falls inside the buyer's specific 10-year request should have been identified even if you thought it was outdated." My father's expression changed. Not much, but enough. Facts were never his favorite terrain when they stopped supporting him. "You do understand," he said, "that sellers do not volunteer every piece of pessimistic paper ever produced about an asset. That isn't what anyone is asking. It is exactly what you are doing." "No." The buyer asked for material West Wing engineering and redevelopment studies from the last 10 years. This is one. If you believed it had been superseded, you could have identified it as superseded. Douglas looked at Megan. "Is she representing the company now?" "No," Megan said. "Lauren is not part of the transaction. I'm asking the same question independently." His jaw tightened. Erica stepped closer to the table. "If it was irrelevant, why wasn't it listed?" Douglas exhaled. "Because not every old document deserves oxygen." "That's not an answer." "It is an answer." "No, it's your opinion about the report. And after 40 years in this business, my opinion carries some weight. It carried enough weight that you reviewed the historical material category before I signed." That stopped him. Erica's voice remained quiet. "Did you know this report wasn't in the package when I signed the certificate?" My father looked at her for a long second. Legal assembled the package. Megan spoke immediately, based on the responsive materials supplied through management review. Douglas ignored her. "Erica, you are the chief operating officer. You oversee operations. You had access to the index. There it was. Small. Almost reasonable. A shift of weight. Not enough to sound like blame yet. Enough that I heard it. So did Erica." Her face changed. "I'm asking whether you knew." "I knew historical materials had been screened. And you knew this existed. I already told you that. Did you know it was excluded?" Douglas rubbed his forehead. "I knew it was not part of the current redevelopment work because it should not have been." "That still isn't what I asked." I protected the process from noise. Erica stared at him. "What does that mean?" "It means I knew what would happen if every 7-year-old worst-case analysis was dropped into the middle of a live sale. What would happen? You would panic. The room went silent. My father must have heard the sentence after he said it, because he tried to soften it immediately. Not panic emotionally. I mean, you would do exactly what you're doing now. Stop everything. Reopen settled questions. Let a buyer turn routine diligence into leverage. Erica's face had gone very still. You didn't think I could read the report and decide whether it mattered. I did decide whether it mattered. For me. For the company. I signed the certificate. And as coup, you make decisions based on information prepared through a process. You cannot personally review every historical document. That isn't the point. It is exactly the point. This company has lawyers, finance people, engineers, managers. Your job is to run the business, not dig through old files, because Lauren Bennett has decided history owes her an apology. He had turned it back toward me. That was familiar too. If Erica stayed angry with him, she might ask another question. If he made me the problem again, maybe she would stop. For years, it had worked. I looked at my sister. She was not looking at me. She was looking at him. I want the certification reviewed, she said. Douglas's head snapped toward her. No. Megan spoke carefully. Douglas, if responsive historical information has been identified, reviewing whether a supplement is appropriate is the prudent step. We are in the middle of a transaction. Yes, you start waving supplemental disclosures around and the buyer assumes there is a problem. There may be a completeness issue. There is a Lauren issue. Erica put the report down. No, there's my name on a certificate. My father's voice hardened. Then act like an executive instead of letting your sister frighten you. I felt the sentence before I fully understood why. Erica did too. Her shoulders straightened. Is that what you told yourself when she left? Douglas frowned. What? That Lauren was frightened. This is not about 2019. It seems to be about 2019 every time you need to explain why I shouldn't read something. Erika. No. You said you protected me from noise because I would panic. What did you tell yourself you were protecting me from 7 years ago? His patience disappeared. I do not have time for this. He turned toward Megan. Handle the report however you need to handle it without derailing the transaction. Then he looked at Erica. And you need to remember what is at stake. There are employees in this building who do not have the luxury of turning every disagreement into a moral crisis. His eyes came to me last. That has always been your weakness. I almost answered. Then I realized something. 7 years earlier. That sentence would have kept me awake for a week. Now it sounded rehearsed. Not because he had necessarily planned the words. Because he had spent so long defining my boundaries as defects that he no longer seemed capable of hearing himself do it. I said, You should probably go. His eyebrows rose. This is my hotel, and this is Megan's review meeting. He stared at me. For 1 second, I thought he would refuse simply because I had told him to leave. Then he looked at Erica, perhaps expecting her to correct me. She did not. Douglas walked out. The door closed behind him. None of us spoke for several seconds. Then Erica sat down. He thinks I'll panic. I stayed standing. I heard him. He spent 7 years telling me you couldn't handle pressure. I looked at her. What exactly did he tell you? Megan gathered the papers into a neat stack. I think the family portion of this conversation is better without me. She told Erica she would begin reviewing the certification issue and call later that afternoon. Then she left us alone. I took the chair across from my sister. Erica did not look up. After you resigned, Dad said you were furious because the board wouldn't let you dictate the capital plan. That's not what happened. I know that now. She traced one finger along the edge of the report. He said you'd always needed to be the smartest person in the room. That you couldn't stand having your judgment questioned. I nearly smiled, though there was nothing funny about it. He told me you were jealous when he started giving me more responsibility. That one hurt more. Did you believe him? At the time? Yes. She thought about it. Yes. I nodded. I could not punish her for honesty after asking for it. What else? He said you'd spent years assuming the Beaumont would be yours one day and couldn't handle realizing there would be 2 of us making decisions. He sat back. The brass key in my pocket suddenly felt heavier. My father had once told me I would protect the Beaumont. Apparently, after I left, that memory became evidence that I had wanted to possess it. Erica finally looked at me. What did he tell you about me? I could have protected her. Or myself. I could have chosen the gentler version. That would have been another form of controlling information. He said you understood loyalty. Her expression did not change immediately. When? After he shifted the West Wing work away from me. What exactly did he say? I searched my memory carefully. I don't remember every word. I'm not going to pretend I do. But I remember telling him he was giving you responsibility for something you hadn't been in the technical meetings for. He said you understood what it meant to put the family ahead of being right. Erica looked away. I continued. Later, when I resigned, Mom told me Dad was relieved. At least one daughter knew the difference between independence and betrayal. That sounds like her. It does. So you thought I was helping him push you out? Yes. Because he told you I was loyal? Yes. And I thought you left because you couldn't stand me getting promoted? Yes. Neither of us said anything. For years, I had imagined our family split like a clean line. Dad and Erica on one side, me on the other. Sitting there, I saw something uglier. There had never been one story. My father had given each of us the version most likely to keep us from comparing notes. To me, Erica was proof that obedience would be rewarded. To Erica, I was proof that questioning Dad would destroy the family. He did not need to tell either of us to hate the other. He only needed to explain our pain in a way that made the other sister responsible for it. Erica laughed quietly. I used to hate when he compared me to you. I thought you loved it. No, he praised you constantly. To you, maybe. I frowned. She looked almost embarrassed. To me, you were the standard. What? He'd say, Lauren never needed 3 reminders. Or, Lauren understood this business before she was 30. Or, your sister would have caught that. I stared at her. That stopped after I left. Not completely. Something shifted in my chest. Not forgiveness. Understanding. They were different. Understanding could make a wound more accurate without making it smaller. Erica continued. Then after you left, suddenly I was the reliable one. I thought I'd finally proved I belonged there. You did belong there. You know what I mean. I did. My father had turned approval into a moving target. When I was useful, I was the future of the company. When I challenged him, I became difficult. When Erica was behind me, she was compared to me. When I left, she became the daughter who understood loyalty. The roles looked like rewards. They were instructions. Erica pushed the assessment away. You still left me. There it was. The sentence I deserved. I could have said Dad caused it. I could have said I was 31, furious, humiliated, and trying to protect my career. All of those things were true. None of them answered her. Yes, I said. You let me believe his version for 7 years. Yes. You ignored my calls. Yes. I was 26, Lauren. I know. You were my sister before you were his employee. That one went straight through me. I looked down at my hands. I was wrong to leave you without telling you why. Her eyes stayed on mine. I forced myself to finish the sentence without softening it. I wasn't wrong to leave him. Erica's mouth tightened. I didn't say you were. No, but I need you to understand the difference. I'm sorry I punished you for something I never asked whether you knew. I'm not sorry I refused to put my name behind something I didn't believe. She looked down. You could have told me. I should have. You could have called back. Yes. You could have given me one chance. Yes. The answers hurt. Good. They were supposed to. For 7 years, I had used my father's manipulation to explain a choice that was still mine. He had created the conditions. I had chosen silence. Both could be true. Erica wiped one hand across her face, more frustrated than tearful. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that. Nothing today. That's convenient. It's honest. She looked at me sharply. I'm not asking you to forgive me because we found a report. I don't. I know. I'm still angry. I know that too. That was where we left it. No hug. No promise that we would fix 7 years over lunch. But when I stood to leave, Erica asked me to wait. Megan is going to call about the certification. Okay. I want you there. Why? Because if Dad comes back in, I need someone in the room who remembers that this is about what was actually disclosed, not whether you're dramatic or I'm panicking. I considered it. I'll stay for that conversation, but I'm not joining the sale. I know. And I'm not making the decision for you. I know. That was new too. My mother found me before Megan called. I had gone downstairs for coffee and was crossing the quieter side of the lobby when Marianne stepped out of the lounge. She looked immaculate. Of course she did. My mother could have survived a hurricane and emerged offended that the wind had disturbed her hair. We need to talk. I'm having a very repetitive month. This isn't funny. I agree. She guided me toward an empty sitting area as if she still believed positioning a conversation correctly gave her control over it. The lobby was busy enough that neither of us could raise our voices without being heard. That suited her. You are turning Erica against your father. No. You appear after 7 years, carrying an old report, and suddenly she's questioning everything. She should question things she signs. She has been running this property successfully without your supervision. I know. My mother paused. That was not the argument she expected. I'm not questioning Erica's competence. Then stop undermining her. Finding a document she should have known existed is not undermining her. You know exactly what you're doing. What am I doing? You want vindication. I thought about that. Part of me did. I would have been lying if I denied it. I wanted it for a long time. And now you finally have your opportunity. No, now Erica has a certification problem. My mother's lips thinned. There would not be a problem if you had left the past where it belonged. That sentence told me almost everything I needed to know about Marianne Bennett. The problem was never the thing itself. The problem was someone refusing to help hide it. You humiliated me at my wedding because I didn't hold it at the Beaumont. That is not why. It was part of it. You publicly rejected your family. I got married somewhere else. You invited people who have known us for decades to watch you pretend the Beaumont meant nothing to you. I stared at her. So you took a microphone. I answered what you were doing. You called my wedding a disgrace in front of 180 people. You had already made your statement. I almost admired the consistency. Even now, she did not see her behavior as an action, only a response, something I had forced her to do. If family stability matters so much, I said, why did you try to destroy my wedding? I did not destroy your wedding. You tried. I was protecting our family's dignity. And now you want me to protect it again by ignoring a disclosure issue. Her eyes flashed. I want you to understand there are consequences beyond your feelings. This isn't about my feelings. It is always about your feelings with you. I let that sit. 7 years ago, I would have started listing facts. My qualifications. The report. The data room request. Erica's certificate. I no longer needed to win every false accusation. Instead, I asked, why are you so afraid of Erica and me talking to each other? My mother blinked. I'm not. Then stop trying to keep us from comparing what Dad told us. That is absurd. Is it? You two have always been competitive. Who taught us to be? Her expression hardened. Do not rewrite your childhood because you are angry with your father. I'm not rewriting anything. You had advantages Erica never had. And Erica had responsibilities I walked away from. That slowed her. I continued. Both can be true. Marianne stared at me as if moderation itself was betrayal. You think you're being very wise. No, I think I'm about 7 years late. My mother stood. Before walking away, she leaned closer. If this sale falls apart, people will lose jobs. Your father will lose what his family spent generations building. Erica may lose everything she has worked for. I hope being right is worth that. There it was again. Not, is the disclosure complete? Not, what should Erica do? Only, can you live with what happens if the truth becomes expensive? I watched her cross the lobby toward the main staircase. For most of my life, guilt had worked on me because my family treated consequence as proof of wrongdoing. If telling the truth caused pain, then telling the truth must have been cruel. If setting a boundary upset them, then the boundary must have been selfish. If refusing to sign created a problem, then refusal must have caused the problem. I was finally learning to separate those things. By the time I returned upstairs, Megan was waiting with Erica and another woman I recognized from family business events. Diane Whitaker. She had served on the Bennett Heritage Board for several years and was one of the 2 directors who was not family. Her presence immediately changed the weight of the meeting. Erica introduced us, though we had met before. I asked Diane to sit in because I don't want this treated as a dispute between me and Dad. Diane nodded. That's wise. Megan opened a folder. I've reviewed the certification language, the diligence request, the historical assessment, and the current index. My recommendation is straightforward. Erica clasped her hands together. Go ahead. The seller should supplement the response to identify the 2019 assessment as a historical study, explain that management considered it superseded, and provide it through the controlled diligence process. I also recommend a temporary hold on further reliance on the existing West Wing certification until the technical assumptions are refreshed. Erica went pale. How temporary? That depends on the buyer's response and how quickly technical diligence can be expanded. Could they walk? Yes. Megan did not soften it. Could they lower their price? Yes. Could the report turn out to be irrelevant? Yes. Erica looked at me. I said nothing. This was her decision. She turned back to Megan. What happens if I do nothing? The company could continue to take the position that the historical assessment was superseded and not material. But now that you personally know it exists and know it fits the literal category requested, I would not advise you to continue signing or reaffirming completeness without resolving it. Diane spoke for the first time. What does Douglas want? Erica gave a short laugh. You heard enough earlier. I want to hear what you want. Erica looked toward the window. The Beaumont was full beneath us. Guests arriving, housekeepers changing rooms, kitchen staff preparing dinner. A hotel was not an abstract asset when you knew the people who kept it alive. I don't want to kill the deal. No one said you were, Diane replied. My father will. Your father is not the buyer, the lender, or your counsel. Erica looked at me again. I don't know what to do. It would have been easy to answer. Pause it. Correct it. Do what I did. Say no. That would also have made me exactly what my father accused me of being. Someone who needed everyone else to reach the same conclusion I had reached. So I told her the only thing I was sure of. Whatever you choose it, knowing everything. She held my gaze. If I do this and the buyer cuts the price, that will be their decision. If staff get scared, they probably will. If Dad blames me, he might. And if the report turns out not to matter, then you'll know that too. She looked down at the certification. For 7 years, Erica had been the daughter who stayed, the one who absorbed pressure, the one who signed. I had mistaken that for privilege. Sitting there, I began to understand what it had cost her. She picked up the pen. Megan slid the supplemental instruction across the table. It did not cancel the sale. It directed counsel to identify the historical assessment, temporarily suspend reliance on Erica's existing West Wing completeness certification, and coordinate expanded technical diligence before the seller reaffirmed those assumptions. Erica read every line. Then she signed. She handed the document back to Megan and looked at Diane. Send it. Megan gathered the papers. Erica's voice stopped her. And put this in the instruction. Megan waited. Erica looked at the signature she had just made. Then she said, I'm not signing blind again. The next week was the quietest kind of dangerous. No one stormed into my office. No one threatened lawsuits. No newspaper called. No employees marched out of the Beaumont. And Meridian did not pull its offer the moment Megan supplemented the diligence response. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside the transaction, however, the question had shifted from whether my old assessment existed to whether the problems it identified still mattered enough to change what the hotel was worth. Meridian did not send a brand new team to Charleston, as if my 7-year-old report had triggered an emergency investigation. Their engineering consultants had already been inspecting the property as part of normal diligence. After receiving the historical assessment, Olivia Grant, the partner handling the transaction after Ethan recused himself, authorized them to expand the work they were already doing. They compared the old West Wing findings with current conditions, updated capital estimates, recent repair records, and the redevelopment plan the seller had been using. I was not part of that team. That mattered to me almost as much as the result. When the consultants had questions about what I had observed in 2019, they went through Megan. She asked whether I was willing to answer a limited set of technical history questions, and I agreed. I explained what certain notes referred to, which layouts had triggered structural concerns, and why the old mechanical estimate had expanded during the original study. I did not tell them what I thought the hotel was worth, because I did not know. I did not tell them what Meridian should pay, because it was not my deal. My father hated that arrangement. He wanted me either completely outside the process or useful to him. There was no category in Douglas Bennett's world for a daughter who would cooperate with factual questions but refuse to become anyone's advocate. 3 days after the expanded review began, he called me. "Are you talking to their engineers?" I answered questions through counsel. "What questions?" "You can ask Megan. I'm asking you, and I'm telling you the information exchange is being handled through counsel." He went quiet in the way he did when he believed someone had mistaken a boundary for authority. Then he said, "You understand they are going to use every word you give them against us. I understand they're checking a redevelopment assumption. You gave them a roadmap. They already had a building. That is exactly the kind of answer that makes people think you enjoy this." I nearly defended myself. Instead, I asked, "Enjoy what?" Watching me be proved wrong. There it was again. Not whether the West Wing required more capital. Not whether Erica's certification needed to be corrected. Whether Douglas Bennett would be proved wrong. "I'd rather the review say I overestimated everything," I told him. "That would be better for the hotel." He did not believe me. Maybe 7 years earlier, I would not have believed myself either. The result came 5 days later. Erica called me from the Beaumont and asked if I could come in. Her tone was controlled, but she did not sound frightened. She sounded like someone who had finally received a number after spending a week imagining worse ones. Megan met us in the same conference room. Diane Whitaker was there as well, along with a slim summary from the Independent Engineering Review. No one placed a dramatic folder in front of me. Megan simply told me the conclusion. "The Beaumont is operable." I waited. "The West Wing can be redeveloped." I nodded. Erica watched my face. Megan continued. "The buyer's consultant did not identify a structural condition requiring closure of the wing. Current repairs appear to have addressed the known localized issues we discussed. Life safety and existing operations are not the problem." My shoulders loosened. I had not realized how much tension I had been carrying until that moment. "Good." Erica looked at me almost suspiciously. "You mean that?" "Of course I mean it." Megan turned a page. "The redevelopment economics are the issue." There it was. The current plan assumed targeted mechanical work, where the consultant believed broader upgrades would likely be required for the proposed luxury suite conversion. Moisture remediation was manageable, but the allowance was too light. Preservation constraints reduced some of the cheaper redesign options. None of those issues made the project impossible. Together, however, they pushed the estimated capital requirement materially above the seller's model and extended the time before the additional rooms would generate the projected revenue. I read the summary slowly. Some of my 2019 numbers were wrong now. Not directionally wrong. Old. Construction costs had moved. Certain equipment assumptions no longer applied. A structural allowance I had included had been reduced because the current room layout was different. One moisture contingency had grown because later inspections revealed work my old report could not have known about. I pointed to the structural line. "My old estimate was higher here." Erica looked at me. "You're saying your report overstated something?" "Yes." She almost smiled. I understood why. For 7 years, she had been told my greatest weakness was needing to be right. Watching me identify where the old report no longer matched current conditions probably mattered more to her than any apology I could have given. I pointed farther down the page. "But mechanical is worse." "It is," Megan said. "And the preservation allowance. Higher than the seller model." He sat back. "So the conclusion is the same shape, not the same number." "That's a fair way to put it. Redevelopment was possible. It simply cost more and took longer than the story being told about it." My father arrived 30 minutes later and somehow managed to hear only the first half. "The building is fine." He stood at the end of the conference table with his hands on the back of a chair, looking more energized than I had seen him since the wedding. I told everyone this was ridiculous. Erica did not look up from the summary. No one said the building was unsafe. Douglas waved one hand. For 2 weeks we have treated a functioning hotel like some hidden catastrophe was discovered behind the walls. No, I said. You have. His eyes narrowed. The review says the West Wing is viable. Yes. Then we are done. Megan shook her head. We are not. He turned toward her. The buyer's consultant confirmed redevelopment. They also materially increased the projected capital requirement and extended the revenue upside timeline. Consultants always add money. That does not make the adjustment disappear. Douglas looked at Erica. You see what's happening, don't you? They found nothing dangerous. So now the argument moves to price. Erica finally looked up. The argument was always price. He stared at her. She held his gaze. You told me Lauren treated the West Wing like it was failing. Her report didn't say that. You told me the current review would prove the old concerns were meaningless. It didn't do that either. It proved the building works. We already knew the building works. I watched my father realize that the daughter who once repeated his explanations was no longer using his language. He did not like it. The asset speaks for itself, he said. The Beaumont is unique. They are not going to walk away over a capital adjustment. Maybe he was right. That was the uncomfortable part. Douglas was not a fool. He had spent 4 decades in hospitality. The Beaumont was a rare property in a market buyers wanted. A buyer could discover additional capital needs and still decide the hotel was worth almost exactly what it had been worth before. He was making a judgment. The problem was that he had begun treating every judgment he made as something reality owed him. That afternoon, my mother called. She did not bother with small talk. Your father says the engineering review confirmed the hotel is safe. It confirmed the current operation is viable. Which is what we have been saying. That was never the dispute. I am not interested in another technical lecture. Then why did you call? She hesitated. I already knew. Ethan needs to understand that this was overblown. I closed my eyes. No, you haven't even heard what I'm asking. You want me to tell my husband the report wasn't a big deal. I want you to make sure he has context. He is recused. He is still the managing partner. And that is exactly why I'm not using my marriage to go around the deal team. My mother lowered her voice as though someone might overhear us, despite being on the phone. You are being absurdly rigid. No, I'm being consistent. Lauren. Your father was humiliated at your wedding because he did not know who Ethan was. You could at least make sure this situation isn't being distorted because of family tension. I laughed once. You humiliated me at my wedding. Dad was embarrassed afterward because he realized the man he had just insulted was someone he wanted something from. Those are not the same thing. That is an ugly interpretation. It's the sequence of events. Ethan could clear this up in one conversation. No. You would let the family lose millions over a principle? If the buyer changes the price because the work costs more than they were told to expect, that isn't me costing anyone millions. My mother went silent. I knew that silence. She was trying to move the guilt until she found a place where it would stick. Finally, she said, I hope you remember how easy it was to say that if people lose their jobs. I did remember it. I also remembered how many times my family had used unnamed employees as moral hostages whenever they wanted one of us to accept something we would otherwise question. I hope no one loses a job, I said. I'm still not calling Ethan. Then I ended the conversation. 2 days passed without news. I worked. Erica worked. Ethan did not ask me for details, and I did not offer them. We had become almost comically careful about the Beaumont. He knew there was expanded diligence because my family had made it impossible not to know something was happening. But he did not ask what the consultant concluded. I did not ask whether Meridian's investment committee was worried. The boundary was inconvenient. That was how I knew it was real. On the 9th of May, Erica asked me to meet her at Megan's office instead of the Beaumont. That was the first sign something had changed. The second was my father's car parked outside. He was already inside when I arrived, but Megan kept me in a separate conference room. I was not part of the negotiation, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. I appreciated that. 20 minutes later, Erica came in, carrying a legal pad. She closed the door behind her. They revised the offer. I did not ask for the number immediately. Still buying? Yes. That surprised me more than I expected. The old report had not killed the sale. The expanded engineering review had not killed the sale. The Beaumont remained something Meridian wanted. Erica sat across from me. The headline number is about 68 million. I tried to remember what little I had known about the earlier expectations. That's lower. Materially. Survivable? Her expression changed. You really don't know. No. She rubbed one hand over her forehead. Yes. It's survivable. I waited. Debt gets paid. Transaction obligations get paid. There's still meaningful equity left. How meaningful? I'm not giving you the full waterfall. I didn't ask for it. She gave me a tired smile. No, you didn't. Something about that moment stayed with me later. A month earlier, Erica would have assumed every question I asked was an attempt to prove she did not understand her own company. Now she was beginning to recognize when I was actually asking and when I was not. There's another piece, she said. What? The lender. I leaned back. Bennett Heritage's financing had been under pressure for months, but I still did not know the detailed covenant package. I did not need to. Erica explained the part that mattered. An upcoming financial test was likely to create a default problem if the company reached the deadline without a qualified transaction in place. The lender was willing to give them protection, but not indefinitely. If Bennett Heritage signed a qualified purchase agreement by May 15th and the buyer funded the required earnest money, the bank would waive the upcoming covenant default and extend the loan maturity long enough for the hotel sale to close normally. I made her repeat it. Signing before the 15th buys you the time to close. Yes, you don't have to close by the 15th. No. That was the whole point of the waiver. And if you don't sign, the protection disappears. I sat very still. That was the first moment I understood the shape of the choice in front of my father. Until then, everything had been complicated enough for Douglas to hide behind judgment calls. Was my old report too conservative? Maybe. Was it material? Counsel could debate that. Did the buyer's revised capital estimate overstate some work? Possibly. Business deals were full of disagreement. This was simpler. They had a buyer. They had an offer. The offer was lower than Douglas wanted, but high enough to pay the obligations and preserve substantial equity. And the lender was giving them a path to complete the transaction without falling into default, provided they committed before a specific deadline. The truth had not destroyed the Beaumont. It had changed the price. I asked, "What does Dad think?" Erica looked toward the closed door. "He thinks it's insulting." That's not what I asked. It's what he thinks. I understood. Does he think Meridian will increase it? Yes. Why? He thinks the engineering adjustment is negotiation theater. He thinks the Beaumont is too unique for them to walk. That's possible. Erica stared at me. You're agreeing with him? I'm saying it's possible. After everything? Erica, being angry with Dad doesn't make every judgment he makes wrong. A buyer can lower an offer and still come back up. She leaned back, frustrated. Then what am I supposed to do? I don't know. You keep saying that. Because I don't have your board seat. Her expression softened. I continued. I don't know Meridian's model. I don't know every covenant. I don't know what other bidders exist. I know the engineering conclusion because my work became part of the correction. I know what you just told me about the revised offer and lender deadline because counsel said you could tell me. That's it. And what would you do? There was a time when I would have answered immediately. Maybe that was what she expected. Instead, I said, I'd make sure I understood what happens if I'm wrong. She looked at me. If Dad rejects 68 because he thinks they'll come back at 75, what happens if they don't? The waiver deadline still comes. And if they do come back, then we negotiate. So the real question isn't whether he might be right. No, it's whether the company can afford for him to be wrong. I nodded. Erica looked down at the legal pad. Neither of us needed to say anything else. A few minutes later, raised voices came through the wall. My father. Then Charles Wynne, my mother's brother, and another director. I could not make out the words. I did not try. Megan opened the door and stepped into our room. Lauren, Douglas wants to speak with you. About what? He wants you to confirm to him that the independent review did not identify a safety issue. I can do that. Erica stood. Megan held up one hand. He also wants you to say the 2019 report should not materially affect valuation. No. Megan nodded. That is what I told him you would say. We went into the larger conference room together. Douglas was standing near the window. Marianne sat beside him. Charles was at the table with several pages in front of him. I did not know whether those pages were the actual offer, and I deliberately did not look closely enough to find out. My father turned toward me. Tell them. Tell them what? That your report never said the building was unsafe. It didn't. He looked toward Charles as if that settled everything. I continued. It also said the redevelopment required more capital than the plan being used at the time. His expression darkened. We are talking about 7 years ago. Yes. And the current engineer says redevelopment works. Yes. Then say the old report was overblown. No. Mariana Sahil. Lauren. I ignored her. My 2019 numbers are not current numbers. Some were too high compared with the current review. Some current conditions are worse than what I saw then. The useful conclusion is not that I was perfectly right 7 years ago. It is that redevelopment needs more capital and more time than the seller assumptions reflected. The buyer's own consultant reached that conclusion. Douglas stared at me. You understand what they're doing? I understand they revised their price. They are using your report to take $11 million off the table. No. They used current diligence to revise their price. He turned away from me. It is humiliation dressed up as engineering. There was the word. Humiliación. Not insolvency. Not survival. Not employees. Humiliation. For the first time, I saw the revised offer through my father's eyes. $68 million did not mean the company could repay its obligations and walk away with substantial equity. It meant someone else had assigned a number to the Beaumont lower than the number Douglas Bennett believed his stewardship deserved. The price was not only money, it was a verdict. Charles said carefully. Doug, the bank condition matters. I know what the bank condition says. We sign a qualified agreement before the 15th. We keep the waiver through closing. I understand it. And if we don't? I said I understand. The room went quiet. Erica was standing near the far end of the table. What if they don't come back up? My father looked at her. They will. You don't know that. I know this asset. That isn't the same thing. His face tightened. You have spent the last 2 weeks letting everyone frighten you into believing we are weak. No. I spent the last 2 weeks finding out what I signed. And now you are letting a buyer use caution against us. Erica looked down briefly, then back at him. I'm asking what happens if you're wrong. Douglas did not answer that. He looked toward the pages on the table, then toward the windows. Beyond them, somewhere several blocks away, stood the Beaumont. The building he had inherited, expanded, defended, and turned into the measure of his own worth. My father picked up the revised offer. He looked at the number again. When he spoke, his voice was calm. That was how I knew the decision was becoming personal. No Bennett sells under pressure. My father said it as if the sentence settled the matter. For most of my life, it probably would have. The phrase had existed in our family for so long that I could no longer remember when I first heard it. My grandfather used variations of it whenever someone tried to rush a decision. Dad repeated it through recessions, renovation disputes, insurance negotiations, and more than one ugly refinancing conversation. At 16, I thought it meant Bennetts were disciplined. At 38, standing in Megan's conference room 4 days before a lender deadline, I began to understand how easily discipline could become pride once no one was allowed to question the person defining the difference. Charles looked down at the pages in front of him. Doug, no one is suggesting we sign because we're afraid. That is exactly what this is. Erica shook her head. It's a real offer. It's a repriced offer, built around a consultant's worst-case assumptions. The engineering review wasn't worst case. My father turned toward her. You've been talking to Lauren too much. I watched my sister's face close. A month earlier, that sentence might have worked. Now, she simply said, the consultant doesn't work for Lauren. Douglas looked toward me as though my physical presence proved his point anyway. I had no reason to stay in that room. I was not a director. I did not own the decision. Whatever materials sat on the table were not mine to review. Megan had allowed me into the conversation only because my father had specifically demanded that I clarify what my old assessment did and did not say. I had done that, so I picked up my bag. I'm leaving. Marianne looked almost offended. Of course you are. I stopped. She had perfected that tone over decades. It could turn walking out of a room into abandonment, refusing a request into cruelty, and silence into confession. I looked at her. I've answered every question I'm qualified to answer. I'm not voting on the sale. No, she said. You just helped lower the price. No. Current engineering changed the buyer's assumptions. You opened the door to information they requested. You always find a technical way to absolve yourself. I could have spent 10 minutes dismantling that sentence. Instead, I turned to Megan. If anyone has another technical history question, send it through you? Yes. Then I'm done. Erica stood. Wait. She looked toward our father. Dad, I want Lauren to hear one thing before she goes. His expression hardened. What? The advisor memo. Douglas's eyes moved to Megan. She is not entitled to board materials. She isn't getting board materials, Erica said. Megan already cleared the headline terms I discussed with her yesterday. My father looked at me. You've been discussing our financing with her? I discussed the deadline I'm personally being asked to make decisions around. You had no authority to do that. Megan spoke before Erica could answer. She did not disclose privileged deliberations or detailed lender terms. She confirmed information counsel determined could be shared because Lauren had been asked to participate in technical clarification, and Douglas repeatedly suggested her report was creating a crisis the company could not survive. My father gave her a look I would not have wanted directed at me 20 years earlier. Megan seemed completely unaffected. Erica faced me. The outside advisor's conclusion is that the revised offer is financially survivable. I nodded. She continued. It covers the secured obligations and transaction-related liabilities we've discussed. It preserves meaningful equity. It is lower than everyone hoped, but accepting it does not wipe out Bennett Heritage. Douglas interrupted. That is an oversimplification. It is the headline conclusion. It assumes a fire sale mentality. No, it assumes the offer currently on the table. He looked at Charles. Do you hear what she's doing? Charles did not answer. Erica kept going. The lender will honor the conditional waiver if we have a qualified purchase agreement signed by May 15th and the required earnest money is funded. If we don't, the upcoming financial test happens without that protection. I already knew most of that from our earlier conversation, but hearing it stated in front of Douglas mattered. There would be no confusion later. No claim that the deadline had been buried in fine print. No story in which nobody explained what refusing the offer could cost. My father leaned against the table. We know the deadline. Then we know what waiting means. It means we negotiate. It means we negotiate without the waiver if we miss the 15th. We will not miss anything. Meridian wants this property. Erica looked at him. They already revised their offer. They are testing us. What if they aren't? My father's answer came immediately. They are. The certainty in his voice frightened me more than anger would have. I left before the discussion turned into a closed-board strategy session. That distinction mattered later. I did not sit in the room while directors debated price. I did not hear every argument. I did not watch anyone cast a vote. What I knew afterward came from Erica, from the portions of the minutes I was later shown, and from the documents that became relevant when everyone started arguing about who had caused what. At the time, I walked out of Megan's building believing I had finished my role. I was wrong. The next morning, my father asked me to meet him. Not at the Beaumont. Not at the family house. At his private club. I almost refused on principle. Then he sent a second message. One conversation. No Ethan. No lawyers. I want you to understand what you're doing. That last sentence was the reason I went. Not because I thought he would change my mind. Because I finally understood that if I allowed Douglas to rewrite the next few days the way he had rewritten 2019, I would spend years hearing that no one had warned him. I met him on a covered terrace overlooking a golf course I had been brought to since childhood. and never particularly liked. He was already seated. A glass of iced tea sat untouched in front of him. You came. You asked. He gestured toward the chair opposite him. I sat. For a minute, neither of us spoke. Then Douglas said, 68 million. I waited. That is what your report has done. No, do not give me another lecture about independent engineering. Then don't make a statement that requires one. His eyes hardened. You were always like this. Like what? More interested in being technically correct than understanding what a decision means to the people living with it. That was familiar enough that it did not hurt the way he expected. I said, the revised offer pays the obligations. That is not the standard. It leaves equity. That is not the standard either. What is? He looked past me toward the course. The Beaumont should never have been valued at 68. There it was. Not could not. Should not. Because? Because they know what it is. They know what they think it's worth after diligence. They know what they can get away with because everyone around me suddenly started acting afraid. Dad, I'm not advising you to sell. His gaze came back to me. Then why are you here? To make sure you understand what you're choosing. I understand perfectly. Good. I leaned forward. The lender protection depends on a signed qualified agreement by the 15th. I know. If you reject the offer and Meridian doesn't increase it before then, that protection goes away. I know. The revised engineering review says the redevelopment works but costs more and takes longer than the seller assumptions reflected. I know. The current offer is still enough to cover the obligations and preserve equity. His mouth tightened. I know. I sat back. Then I'm not advising you. I'm making sure you can never say nobody warned you. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he gave a low laugh. You've been waiting 7 years to say something like that. No. Don't insult me by pretending. I spent 7 years wanting you to admit I was right. That surprised him. I continued before he could use it. I did want that. For a long time. I wanted you to say you should have listened to me. I wanted Erica to understand why I left. I wanted Mom to stop telling people I couldn't handle being challenged. So this is vindication. No. Because I don't need you to admit anything anymore. His expression changed slightly. That, more than anger, seemed to bother him. If the current engineers had concluded my old report was nonsense, I would have accepted it. Some of my old numbers were wrong. I already told Erica that. You expect me to believe you wouldn't care? I'd care. I just wouldn't ask a lender, a buyer, and a building to rearrange themselves around my feelings. Douglas looked away. I saw his hand tighten around the arm of the chair. Then he said, Your grandfather gave me the Beaumont when I was younger than Ethan is now. I stayed quiet. He didn't give me a healthy company. Everyone remembers the polished version, because that's what families do after someone dies. But he handed me debt, rooms that needed work, and a reputation bigger than the balance sheet. I had heard pieces of that story before. Never in quite that tone. I spent 40 years making sure no one could say Douglas Bennett was the generation that lost it. You haven't lost it. If I sell it for 68 after marketing it near 80, what do you think people will say? That the buyer found additional capital requirements. He almost smiled. That is what architects say. What do you think people will say? That I got cornered. The answer came softly. That was the first time I understood exactly what the revised price meant to him. Not $11 million. A public ranking of his life. My grandfather had inherited a damaged hotel and passed it to Douglas. Douglas wanted to pass the story forward as the man who made it stronger. Selling below his own expectation did not feel like a transaction. It felt like a confession. I understood the wound. I did not accept what he was about to do with it. You can't control what people say. No. But I can control whether I accept an insulting price. Until the lender controls the choices. His eyes flashed. They are not taking this hotel. I didn't say they were. You're thinking it. I'm thinking deadlines don't disappear because you dislike them. He leaned forward. Meridian will move. Maybe. They will. Maybe. You have no idea how rare a property like the Beaumont is. You're right. That caught him. I don't know Meridian's investment model. I don't know their maximum price. I don't know what their committee will approve because Ethan doesn't tell me and I haven't asked him. Then why are we having this conversation? Because your gamble isn't that Meridian might increase the offer. He stared at me. Your gamble is what happens if they don't. We left it there. I stood. My father remained seated. As I picked up my bag, he said, "Your grandfather would never have sold under this kind of pressure." I looked at him. I don't know what Grandpa would have done, neither do you. His face tightened. I knew him. Yes, and he's been dead long enough that he can't disagree with the version of him you need. That was crueler than I intended. I almost apologized. Then I remembered how many decisions in our family had been justified by invoking a dead man who conveniently supported whatever Douglas wanted. I left. My mother was waiting beside my car. I should have expected that. Marianne rarely trusted Douglas to manage the emotional aftermath of a conversation without her. You upset him. He asked me here. You didn't have to make it personal. I didn't. She folded her arms. You told him he's using his father as an excuse. I told him none of us knows what Grandpa would do. Some of us knew him better than you did. That is not the issue. What is the issue, Lauren? The company has a survivable offer and a lender deadline. My mother's expression sharpened. You keep using that word. Survivable. It's the advisor's conclusion. Do you know what a sale at that number will look like? I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because there it was. My father's fear had been legacy. My mother's was an audience. It will look like the Beaumont changed owners. Don't be childish. I'm not. People know what price expectations were. People know we have been evaluating options. They will know. Know what? That we had to sell? I looked at her. You are selling. That is different. How? There is an enormous difference between choosing the right moment to monetize an asset and being forced to accept a discounted offer because everyone suddenly decides your company is weak. Mom, the offer pays the debt. Her expression barely moved. And leaves meaningful equity. Again, you reduce everything to numbers. We are talking about selling a hotel. We are talking about a family name attached to a hotel. That sentence explained her better than anything she had said since the wedding. For Marianne, appearance was not decoration around the business. Appearance was part of the asset. What happens if Dad waits and the buyer doesn't move? I asked. They will. That's what he says. He understands this market. And if he's wrong? My mother looked away. For the first time, I saw that she had considered it. She simply preferred the possibility of disaster to the certainty of embarrassment. People will think we were desperate, she said. I stared at her. You would rather risk becoming desperate than let people think you are? Her eyes snapped back to mine. That is not what I said. It's what the choice means. You have always been contemptuous of the social side of this business because you never understood it. I understand reputation matters. Do you? Yes, I also understand reputation doesn't pay a lender. She shook her head. You sound pleased. No, you do. I'm tired. Of what? Being told that if the truth embarrasses this family, the person who said it must have caused the embarrassment. She went still. I opened my car door. My mother said, "If your father loses the Beaumont, he will never forgive you." I looked at her over the roof of the car. That isn't my decision. Then I got in and left. The board met on May 14th. I was not there. For years afterward, if anyone had asked me to describe the room, I could have. I knew the Bennett Heritage boardroom intimately. I knew which seat Douglas preferred, which window stuck in humid weather, and where Marianne usually placed her handbag. But I did not see that meeting. What I learned came first from Erica, and later from the minutes. The charter required 4 of the 5 directors to approve the sale of the flagship property. There were 5 votes. Erica voted yes. Diane Whitaker voted yes. Charles Wynne voted yes. My father voted no. My mother voted no. 3-2. On most ordinary board matters, 3 votes would have carried. For the Beaumont sale, they needed 4. The revised offer was blocked. The minutes also recorded that the outside advisor summarized the financial consequences before the vote. The lender's conditional waiver depended on a signed qualified agreement by May 15th. The board was told the current offer was sufficient to satisfy the relevant obligations and preserve equity. They were told waiting carried the risk that the waiver would expire before another acceptable transaction could be secured. No one hid the choice. No one rushed it through without explanation. My father voted no anyway. Erica called me less than 10 minutes after the meeting ended. I was in my office. I knew before she spoke. He blocked it. I closed my eyes. 3 yes? Yes. Dad and Mom? No. I corrected myself. They voted no? Yes. Her voice sounded exhausted. I sat down. What happens now? Dad thinks Meridian comes back. And the waiver? Tomorrow. 1 word. That was all it took. Are they still negotiating tonight? Charles wants to. Diane does too. Dad thinks calling again makes us look weak. Of course he did. Can you change his mind? I've been trying. I looked at the clock on my desk. For weeks, I had been drawn back into the Beaumont because my old work had become relevant to a current decision. I had answered questions. I had corrected what I could. I had warned my father directly. There was nothing left for me to do. That realization was strangely difficult. When you grow up in a family where everything eventually becomes your responsibility, walking away from a disaster you can see coming feels almost immoral. But I had no vote. I was not the lender. I was not the buyer. And I was not going to turn my marriage into a back channel because Douglas disliked the consequences of his own board vote. Erika. Yeah? You did what you could. That doesn't feel true. It doesn't have to feel true tonight. She was quiet. What are you going to do? Go home. She almost laughed. That's it? That's it. I ended the call, shut down my computer, and went home to my husband without asking him whether Meridian would blink. Looking back now, May 14th was the last moment my father still had the choice he later claimed everyone else had taken from him. The offer was sitting there. The lender condition had been explained. The engineering had been updated. His own board had warned him. His daughters had warned him. And when midnight passed the next day without a signed purchase agreement, the protection Douglas believed he could outwait disappeared with it. For almost 2 weeks after the May 15th deadline passed, my father behaved as if nothing had changed. He kept going to the Beaumont every morning, kept holding department meetings, kept telling Erica that Meridian would either come back or another buyer would recognize what the hotel was really worth. I knew most of that because Erica told me, not because I was there. I had gone back to my own work, and for several days I heard almost nothing about the sale, except the occasional message from my mother telling me that Dad was handling it. Then the month-end liquidity test arrived. Bennett Heritage failed it, exactly the way the financial advisor had warned the board it might if there was no signed transaction and no lender waiver. The bank did not seize the hotel the next morning. It sent a formal notice under the loan documents and requested a meeting. Erica called me the evening the notice arrived. Her voice was tired, but there was none of the panic my father had spent weeks predicting. They're not accelerating tomorrow, she told me. They want reporting, a cash forecast, and a proposal for how we're getting out of this. I asked whether the company could still operate, and she said yes. Payroll was still being met, reservations were still being honored, and guests checking into the Beaumont would have had no idea anything had changed. But the relationship with the lender had changed completely. Before May 15th, Bennett Heritage had been a seller with a bank willing to give it time if it signed a qualified deal. After May 15th, it was a borrower that had failed a test and now needed the bank to agree not to exercise rights it already had. My father had spent weeks refusing to sell under pressure. By the end of May, the pressure was no longer theoretical. Douglas blamed Meridian first. Then he blamed the lender. Then, according to Erica, he blamed the board for showing weakness and the advisors for frightening everyone into accepting a discounted valuation. My name entered the list eventually. But by then, even my mother could no longer claim my old report had caused the default. The dates were too clean. The written conditional waiver had existed before the board vote. The revised offer had been available. The advisor had explained the consequences. Douglas and Marianne had voted no anyway. Nothing I said in 2019 could change what happened on May 14th, and nothing Ethan did or did not do could change the fact that the bank's protection expired because Bennett Heritage never signed the purchase agreement required to keep it alive. In early June, the lender proposed forbearance instead of immediate enforcement. Erica explained the terms to me only after Megan confirmed what she could share. The bank would give the company time to run another sale process and continue normal operations, but it wanted tighter reporting, an independent chief restructuring officer, and a change in who controlled day-to-day decisions affecting the collateral and sale. Douglas could remain a director, but the bank would not agree to forbear while he continued as chief executive with authority to block the process that was supposed to repay the debt. The company's charter required 4 of 5 director votes to sell the Beaumont, but accepting a forbearance agreement and replacing a board-appointed officer only required an ordinary majority. Erica, Diane, and Charles had 3 votes. For the first time in my father's adult life, 2 family votes were not enough to keep him in control. That was when my parents turned their attention fully to Erica. I was not present for the first conversation, but she called me afterward and repeated enough of it that I could hear my father in every sentence. He told her accepting the lender's terms would hand the family business to strangers. Marianne told her people would remember Erica as the daughter who helped remove her own father. Then Douglas changed tactics and reminded her that she was the one he had trusted after I left. Lauren was always difficult, he told her. You were the daughter I could count on. Erica said she had heard versions of that sentence for years and had once treated them like praise. This time she heard the condition hidden inside it. He could count on her as long as counting on her meant she agreed. She came to my house the next night without calling first. Ethan was upstairs on a work call, so Erica and I sat at my kitchen table with 2 glasses of water between us and no business documents anywhere in sight. She looked more exhausted than I had ever seen her, but she was not asking me to make the decision for her. If I vote for the forbearance, Dad loses the CEO role, she said. If I vote against it and the bank decides they've had enough, we could lose control of the timing completely. I told her I understood. She stared at the table for a while, then asked whether I thought our father had ever really wanted either of us to run the company. I said I thought he wanted us near enough to continue his legacy, but not independent enough to redefine it. Erica gave a tired laugh and said, "So I wasn't the golden child. I was the child who still said yes." I did not argue with her. On June 10th, the board accepted the forbearance agreement 3 votes to 2. I was not in the room. Erica told me afterward that Diane voted yes first, Charles second, and she voted third. Douglas voted no. Marianne voted no. The minutes later confirmed the same sequence and recorded the appointment of an independent restructuring officer and the removal of Douglas from the chief executive role. He remained a director and shareholder, but his operational authority ended. He could no longer instruct finance to hold documents, direct staff involved in the sale, negotiate around advisors, or decide which buyer deserved access. The distinction mattered because nobody had stolen the company from him and no judge had marched into the Beaumont to throw him out. His own board, facing a lender default his own decision had helped create, removed the authority it no longer trusted him to use. My father called me that afternoon. He did not say hello. "You finally got what you wanted," he said, and I could hear enough background noise to know he was still somewhere inside the hotel. I told him I had not voted. He said that was convenient, because I had spent months poisoning Erica against him and could now pretend my hands were clean. I almost started listing the dates again. Instead, I told him the only thing that mattered. You had an offer. You had the lender letter. You had the advisor. You had 4 days after Meridian repriced the deal to understand exactly what the deadline meant. You still voted no. He was silent for a moment, then said I had no idea what it was like to protect something for 40 years. I told him he was right about that, but protecting something and refusing to let anyone else make a decision about it were not the same thing. The restructuring officer did not start from zero. That was another fact my mother later tried to distort when she told relatives the lender had forced a rushed fire sale. Bennett Heritage had already run a months-long process. Several buyers had seen the property, reviewed operating information, and gone through enough diligence to understand what they were buying. The restructuring officer returned to 3 pre-qualified bidders and opened the updated data room, now including the West Wing historical assessment, the current engineering review, and the corrected capital assumptions. They were given several weeks to refresh their bids. Meridian was one of them, but Ethan remained outside the transaction. I never asked whether he thought they would win, and he never told me how his firm viewed the process. By then, keeping that boundary had become almost boring, which was exactly how I wanted it. During those weeks, Marianne tried to maintain the appearance that nothing important had changed. She continued attending lunches, charity events, and a summer benefit where the Beaumont had donated rooms. She stopped saying the family was choosing the right time to monetize an asset, though. Erica told me Mom had begun describing the restructuring officer as an advisor assisting with transition, which was technically close enough to truth to sound respectable. The people who actually worked in hospitality and finance knew better. They did not know private covenant terms, and there was no public scandal explaining every detail. But they could see a management change, a restructuring officer, and a reopened transaction moving on a tighter schedule. My mother had spent months fearing people would think the Bennetts were selling under pressure. By June, the effort to avoid that appearance had created the very circumstances that made it obvious. On July 18th, Erica called from her car after the board finished reviewing the best and final bids. I could hear traffic through her speaker, and she sounded strange enough that I asked whether she was all right before asking anything about the hotel. She said she was fine, then told me the winning number was in the low 60 millions, a little over 61 and below 62. I sat down at my desk and did the comparison without needing a spreadsheet. Meridian's revised May offer had been about 68 million. The transaction Douglas called humiliating had been several $1 million better than the one the company was now preparing to accept. The lower price was not some punishment invented by me or Ethan. The bidders now knew the seller had less time, less control, and a lender standing behind the process. Waiting had not restored bargaining power. It had consumed it. I asked Erica whether Dad could block the new transaction. She said not the way he had before. The forbearance structure had shifted control of the sale process, and the board was now operating under the governance conditions agreed with the lender and restructuring officer. Douglas could object, argue, and vote where his vote was still required, but he could not recreate the May 14th stalemate and simply wait for the world to improve. He keeps saying they're stealing millions from us, Erica said. I asked what she had told him. Nothing, she replied. I don't think there's anything left to explain. I understood exactly what she meant. Sometimes repeating the truth does not make a person understand it. It only gives them more words to fight. The Beaumont closed on July 24th. I did not attend the closing, and I did not stand outside the hotel waiting for a dramatic change of locks. The staff continued working. Guests continued checking in. The building looked almost exactly the same the next morning, which was perhaps the cruelest part for my father. The thing he had treated as an extension of himself survived him without ceremony. Afterward, Erica and Megan showed me the transaction summary I was permitted to see. Once costs and obligations were accounted for, the family was not ruined. My parents still had their home, investments, retirement wealth, and interests connected to the other Bennett assets. But the equity left from the Beaumont was several $1 million lower than it would have been under the revised offer they had rejected, and Douglas no longer got to choose the timing, control the process, or describe the sale as something he had orchestrated from strength. For years, my father had repeated that Bennetts did not make decisions under pressure. Then, when the pressure was still manageable, he refused the one decision that could have reduced it. He waited until the lender had rights, the board had lost patience, and the buyers knew exactly how little time the company had left. In May, Douglas had looked at $68 million and called it humiliation. In July, the Beaumont sold for several million less, and this time, he did not have the power to say no. That was the part no one had to explain to him. The Beaumont looked almost exactly the same after it stopped belonging to my family. That surprised me more than the sale itself. The brass sign was still beside the entrance. The same flower arrangement stood in the lobby. Guests rolled suitcases across the same marble floor, while bellmen opened doors and the front desk answered phones. Most of the staff had been offered positions through the transition, including people who had spent 20 or 30 years working under the Bennett name. The new owners did not arrive with trucks and tear the place apart. They bought a functioning hotel, and for the moment, they intended to keep it functioning. My father had spent months talking as if losing control of the Beaumont meant the Beaumont itself would cease to exist. It didn't. Douglas Bennett stopped being the person who decided what happened inside it. That was different. My parents were not ruined. They still owned their house. They had investments, retirement assets, and indirect value tied to the other properties and business interests Bennett Heritage retained. They were still wealthier than most people would ever be. What they had lost was the flagship asset that had defined our family publicly for generations, several $1 million in equity they could have preserved by accepting the earlier offer, and the ability to tell everyone the sale had happened exactly when and how Douglas wanted it to happen. For my father, that last loss may have been the hardest. For my mother, it definitely was. Marianne spent the first week after closing trying to create a version of events that sounded deliberate. She told relatives the family had decided it was time to transition the Beaumont into its next chapter. She described the restructuring officer as if he had been a consultant Douglas personally selected. She never mentioned the expired lender protection, and I doubted she ever would. She did not need to. People in Charleston who understood hospitality and finance knew enough. They saw Douglas leave the chief executive role. They knew the sale process had reopened. They knew the transaction closed faster and at a lower number than the valuation my parents had once spoken about so confidently. Nobody needed private loan documents to understand that the Bennett family had not been negotiating from the position Marianne wanted everyone to imagine. Then she decided what the situation needed was a photograph. She called me 6 days after the closing. I want the 4 of us to have dinner at the Beaumont before the transition is complete. No. I answered so quickly that she went silent. Then came the familiar sigh. Lauren, I have not even explained. You want Dad, you, Erica, and me to sit down together so everyone can see we're still a family. It is a private dinner. Then why does it need to be at the Beaumont? Another silence. We have celebrated every important family event there. I had a pretty important family event somewhere else. You seem to survive. That is unnecessary. So is the dinner. Her voice tightened. We cannot leave things like this. Leave what? Our family. Our family is not a table reservation. You and Erica have made it very clear that you intend to punish us. No. What would you call it? Not pretending. I could almost picture her standing in one of the rooms at home, with her hand pressed against her temple, wondering how both daughters had become so unreasonable at once. People are asking questions, she said. There it was. Then answer them however you want. You know perfectly well what photographs communicate. Yes. That was why I was not going. My mother had tried the same thing at my wedding after publicly calling it a disgrace. Create damage. Then gather everyone close enough for a picture that suggested the damage never happened. I won't be there. You have destroyed enough family unity. No, Mom. I'm just not helping you perform it. She hung up. 15 minutes later, Erica called. I assumed our mother had reached her too. She invited you to dinner? Yes. What did you say? No. Erica laughed. What? Nothing. I just wanted to make sure I said it before you did. I understood. For most of her adult life, Erica had watched one of us resist first, and then calculated how much resistance she could afford. If I said no, she could quietly agree. If I left, she could stay. If Dad pushed, she could find the version of yes that kept the room peaceful. This time, she had already refused before calling me. Good, I said. Mom told me you've poisoned me against family tradition. She said we destroyed family unity. That sounds more dramatic. I'm offended I got the cheaper version. I laughed. It was still strange, laughing with my sister. We were not suddenly best friends. 7 years did not disappear because we finally compared stories. She still became defensive sometimes when I questioned a decision. I still felt the impulse to withdraw whenever a conversation became painful. We had learned enough to recognize those habits before letting them make decisions for us. That was progress. Erica stayed with Bennett Heritage long enough to help complete transition work on the remaining properties, but she had already started talking to companies outside the family business. The first time she told me she had an interview, She made me promise not to give advice unless she asked for it. I agreed. Then she called the next morning and asked anyway. That was progress too. My father waited longer. For nearly 2 weeks after the closing, I heard nothing directly from him. Then he sent one message. Come to the Beaumont tomorrow. There's something I want to discuss before the transition is finished. I considered ignoring it. Instead I went, not because I owed him another conversation, but because I knew there were things I had spent most of my life waiting to hear from Douglas Bennett. I wanted to know what they would sound like now that I no longer needed them. The new ownership group had already begun taking control of administrative spaces, but former Bennett representatives still had limited scheduled access for transition matters. My father asked to meet in his old office. I had not been inside that room alone with him since 2019. Most of the personal photographs were gone. The framed hotel awards had been removed. Shelves that once held years of binders were half empty. From the windows, the courtyard looked exactly as it had when I sat across from him 7 years earlier explaining that the West Wing numbers did not work. Douglas stood beside the desk rather than behind it. That detail stayed with me. For decades, the desk had been almost part of him. You came. You asked. He gestured toward a chair. I remained standing. What did you want to discuss? His eyes narrowed slightly, but he let it go. We still have 2 properties. I know. The company needs direction. You have a board. You know what I mean. I did. He walked toward the window. The smaller hotels need preservation planning. The management contracts need to be reviewed. We can rebuild around what remains. We? He turned. I want you to consult. I stared at him. If he had said that 7 years earlier, I might have agreed before he finished the sentence. If he had said it 1 year earlier, some part of me would have heard an apology even if none had been offered. Now I heard the condition underneath it. Come back. Help repair what happened. Prove you still belong here. Make the family useful to you again, so that you will become useful to the family again. I have my own consultancy. I know. You used to call it a boutique practice, like that was an insult. I was wrong about some things. It was probably the closest Douglas Bennett had ever come to saying he had been wrong without immediately naming someone else's mistake. I waited. He did not go further. Instead, he said, "This was always supposed to be yours." The sentence hit me harder than I expected. Not because I wanted the company, because I remembered how badly the younger version of me had wanted him to say exactly that. At 16, when he handed me the brass key, I had believed love and succession were the same thing. At 25, I thought earning more responsibility meant earning more of him. At 31, when I left, part of my grief had not been about a job at all. I thought I had lost the future that proved my father valued me. Now he was offering part of it back. And I felt almost nothing. No, I said. Douglas frowned. Know what? I'm not coming back. I'm not asking you to become an employee. You're asking me to rebuild the version of the family business you still want. I am asking my daughter to help preserve what her family spent generations creating. There's the difference. What difference? You think being my family creates an obligation to work for you. His jaw tightened. That is not what I said. It's what you've said my whole life. I reached into my purse. My fingers closed around the brass key. I had carried it to the wedding because I wanted something old from the place where I grew up. I had carried it through the West Wing when I returned after 7 years. For months, I had kept moving it from bag to bag without deciding why. I placed it on the desk. My father stared at it. His expression changed. You kept it? Yes. He touched the edge of the key with one finger. I gave you this when you were 16. I remember. I told you one day the Beaumont would be yours to protect. I remember that too. Then why give it back? Because keeping something isn't the same as owing it your life. He looked at me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Douglas picked up the key. I did everything I could to keep this hotel in the family. I shook my head. No. His face hardened. You have no idea what I sacrificed. I believe you sacrificed a lot. Then don't stand there and tell me I didn't fight for it. I'm not. What are you saying? I looked around the office. The room where he had once told me my professional judgment mattered only until it challenged his. The room where he had built a story that turned my refusal into betrayal. The room he no longer controlled. You did everything you could to keep yourself in charge of it. The words landed between us. He looked down at the key. That is a cruel thing to say. It doesn't mean you didn't love the Beaumont. I loved this family. I think you did. That surprised him. I continued. But you kept confusing love with obedience. When I disagreed, I became disloyal. When Erica agreed, she became dependable. Then when she stopped agreeing, you treated her the same way. That is not what happened. It's what happened to us. You turned her against me. No, I had heard that accusation enough. I no longer needed to defend myself from it for 10 minutes. I told her what happened to me. She checked the records herself. She made her own decisions. After you filled her head with your version. And for 7 years, she had yours. His mouth tightened. I could see the argument forming. I was tired of arguments that required me to prove my right to remember my own life. I gave you the truth, I said. What you did with it was your choice. Douglas looked at the brass key in his palm. I waited for an apology. Not because I expected one, because I wanted to know whether some small part of me still needed it. Nothing came, and I was okay. I turned toward the door. Lorraine. I stopped. If you walk away now, don't expect me to keep asking. There was a time when that sentence would have terrified me. I looked back. I'm not asking you to. Then I left his office. Erica was waiting in the lobby. She had not come because I needed protection. She had transition paperwork to drop off with the new management team and had texted that she would probably finish around the same time. One of the front desk employees smiled when we passed. Erica smiled back. Then she looked at me. How bad? He offered me consulting work. Her eyebrows rose. Seriously? Yes. What did you say? No. Mom is going to need a stronger word for what you've done to family unity. I smiled. We walked toward the doors. Near the entrance, Erica slowed. Did he apologize? No. Did you want him to? I thought about it. Once. And now? I wanted him to understand. Did he? I don't know. She nodded. Neither of us needed to pretend that understanding was guaranteed just because we finally said things clearly. Outside, Charleston was hot and bright. Traffic moved along the street. Somewhere behind us, guests were still checking into a hotel that had existed before either of us was born and would continue after our family's name disappeared from the ownership records. Erica had parked in the opposite direction from me. We stood on the sidewalk for a moment. I have an interview Monday, she said. The company in Atlanta? Yes. Do you want my opinion? No. Good luck. She grinned. See, we're learning. We started walking together until the sidewalk split toward our separate cars. That was where the story should probably end if this were about revenge. Dad lost the Beaumont. Mom lost the picture of the perfect Bennett family she had spent decades arranging. Erica stopped being the daughter who said yes because saying no felt dangerous. I kept my company, my marriage, and the life I had built after leaving. But I do not think the most important thing I won was anything they lost. Today is August 8th. The closing happened a little more than 2 weeks ago. Ethan still has no victory speech because the Beaumont was never his fight. His firm's transaction process remained separate from our marriage, exactly as it should have. I am still running the same consultancy I ran before my parents discovered who I was marrying. Erica and I are still figuring out what being sisters looks like when neither of us is using our father as the translator. I also know now that I was not innocent in everything that happened between us. Dad created the story that divided us, but I helped keep it alive by refusing to call my sister back. Admitting that did not require me to accept responsibility for his decisions. That distinction changed my life. You can be wrong about the way you handled pain, and still be right to leave the person who caused it. You can love where you came from without surrendering your future to it. You can warn someone clearly, give them the facts, and then step aside when they knowingly choose pride over the safer road. That is not abandonment. Sometimes, it is the first time you have truly allowed another adult to own the consequences of their own decisions. Erica and I walked away from the Beaumont together that afternoon. At the corner, she headed toward her car and I headed toward mine. For the first time in my life, I did not look back to see whether my father was watching. You can love your family without giving them control over your decisions, your career, or your future. When someone asks you to ignore facts, break professional standards, or sacrifice your stability to protect their reputation, loyalty does not require you to say yes. Ask questions. Document important decisions. Understand what you are signing, and get independent advice when money, business, or legal responsibility is involved. If you make a mistake, own the part that belongs to you. Apologize where necessary and correct it, but do not accept blame for choices other adults knowingly made. Boundaries are strongest when they are clear, consistent, and followed by action. You do not have to rescue someone from consequences they were warned about, especially when saving them would require you to compromise your own integrity. And remember that being the good child should never mean becoming the child who is easiest to control. Healthy families can survive disagreement. Unhealthy ones demand obedience and call it love. Protect your name by protecting your principles, not by protecting appearances. If this story gave you something useful to think about, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more stories about family, betrayal, accountability, and the courage to choose a healthier future.